When Silas Boone ordered a delicate bride through the mail, he never imagined the 6-foot powerhouse who'd step off that train and change his life forever. What happened when this lonely Montana cowboy faced a woman twice his size, and the moment she saved him from his own past, will leave you speechless. Stay with me until the very end of this story, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from so I can see how far this tale has traveled across the world. The Montana Territory stretched endless and unforgiving in the summer of 1887, a land where men measured themselves against horizons that never seemed to end and skies that swallowed whole lives without mercy. In this wilderness of sage and silence, Silas Boone had carved out an existence that most would call lonely and he'd call necessary, a small ranch tucked against the foothills where the only voices he heard belonged to cattle, wind, and the ghosts that visited him in the dark hours before dawn. Silas wasn't a tall man. At 5'6" in his boots, he'd long ago accepted that the world looked down on him in more ways than one. His frame was wiry, built for endurance rather than impression, and his face, weathered by 32 years of Montana sun and sorrow, rarely showed what lived beneath. He spoke little because words had failed him once when they mattered most, and in the years since, silence had become his most faithful companion. But silence, he'd discovered, made poor company on winter nights when the wind howled like wounded animals, and memories came calling with their cold fingers and colder truths. It was desperation, not hope, that drove him to the matrimonial column in the Helena Weekly Herald that February. He'd sat at his rough-hewn table for 3 hours, lamp burning low, trying to compress a lifetime of loneliness into words that wouldn't scare away whoever might read them. The result had been painfully simple. Quiet rancher, 32, seeks kind, gentle woman who loves pie and wildflowers. Must not mind isolation. Write to Silas Boone, care of Great Falls Post Office, Montana Territory. The responses had been few. Most women, it seemed, had little interest in marrying a man who advertised his own insignificance so plainly. But one letter had stood out, written in a careful, elegant hand on paper that smelled faintly of lavender. Dear Mr. Boone, it had begun. Your advertisement spoke to something in my heart. I too know what it means to live quietly, to find beauty in simple things. A good pie crust, the way wildflowers push through hard ground. I believe kindness matters more than crowds, and gentle hearts survive best away from harsh judgment. If you're willing to take a chance on a woman who has known disappointment but not defeat, I would be honored to correspond further. Yours in hope, Nora Bell Hutchins. Over the next 4 months, letters had flown between them like birds carrying spring. Nora wrote of her love for baking, her talent for needlework, her quiet disposition. She described herself as a woman of simple tastes and simpler pleasures, who dreamed of a home where she might finally belong. She spoke of loneliness in terms that made Silas's chest ache with recognition. She never mentioned her height, her build, or the fact that she'd been rejected by every man in 3 counties for reasons she'd learned to anticipate before introductions were even complete. Silas, for his part, wrote of his ranch, his cattle, the way sunrise painted the mountains. He confessed his quietness, his preference for solitude, his contentment with a life stripped to essentials. He never mentioned the nightmares, the guilt, or the brother whose grave he visited every Sunday with hands that still shook when he remembered that terrible night 6 years ago. They were 2 people sketching careful portraits of themselves, leaving out the details that might drive the other away. Not quite lying, but not quite telling the full truth either. It was a courtship built on hope and omission, which is to say it was like most courtships, except they'd never laid eyes on each other. By June, they'd agreed to marry. Silas would send money for her train ticket from St. Louis. Nora would arrive on the 17th, and they'd wed that same day in Great Falls before returning to the ranch. Simple, practical, final. The morning of June 17th dawned clear and bright, the kind of day that mocked nervousness with its cheerful indifference. Silas had risen before the sun, unable to sleep, and spent 2 hours bathing in the creek, trimming his beard, and putting on the one good suit he owned, bought for his brother's funeral and worn only twice since. He'd saddled his gentlest mare and hitched his wagon, then made the 12-mile journey to Great Falls with his hat in his hands and his heart somewhere in his throat. The town was bustling with its usual morning commerce. Miners heading to the smelters, ranchers loading supplies, women with baskets moving between the dry goods store and the butcher. Silas tied his horse near the Great Northern Station and tried not to notice the way people glanced at him, then away, as if embarrassed to witness whatever was about to unfold. News traveled fast in small towns. Word of the mail-order bride had spread through Great Falls like wildfire through dead grass. At the saloon, men had placed bets. At the church, women had clucked their tongues. The general consensus seemed to be that Silas Boone, poor, quiet, undersized Silas Boone, was about to make a spectacular fool of himself. He stood on the platform as the morning stretched toward noon, twisting his hat in his hands until the brim went soft. Around him, other people waited. A family bound for Helena, a merchant expecting freight, a cluster of young men hoping to catch sight of whatever unfortunate woman had agreed to marry the smallest rancher in Cascade County. The train's whistle cut through the valley like a knife through prayer. Silas's heart hammered against his ribs as the locomotive rounded the bend, black smoke streaming, metal wheels screeching against the rails in a sound like the world tearing open. The Great Northern's westbound passenger train was 10 minutes early, which felt like either providence or doom, and Silas couldn't decide which. Steam hissed, brakes caught. The train shuddered to a stop with a final metallic groan that Silas felt in his bones. Passengers began to disembark. A minister in black, 2 children chasing each other, a drummer with cases full of patent medicine. Silas scanned each face, looking for delicate features, gentle eyes, the kind of woman who wrote about pie crust and wildflowers in lavender-scented letters. Then she stepped down from the third car, and the world stopped. Nora Bell Hutchins was not small. She was not delicate. She was not any of the words she'd used to describe herself in 4 months of careful correspondence. She was enormous. 6 feet tall in her travel boots, she towered over every man on the platform. Her shoulders were broad as a farmhand's, her arms thick with the kind of muscle that came from hard labor, not needlework. She wore a simple gray traveling dress that had clearly been made by someone with more practical skill than fashion sense, cut to accommodate a frame that seemed built for different purposes than the dainty parlors of polite society. But it was her face that made Silas forget to breathe. She was beautiful, not in the soft flower petal way of the women in advertisements, but beautiful the way a mountain was beautiful, or a storm. High cheekbones, strong jaw, eyes the color of honey catching sunlight. Her hair, dark as creek stones, was pulled back severely beneath a plain bonnet, but a few strands had escaped during the journey and curled against her neck. When she smiled, and God help him, she was smiling, a smile that split her face like sunrise over the eastern plains, it transformed her from intimidating to incandescent. She spotted him immediately. Perhaps it was the only man on the platform short enough to make her tower even more obvious, or perhaps it was the sheer terror written across his face, but her eyes locked onto his across 15 feet of Montana dust, and she strode forward with the confidence of someone who'd long ago stopped apologizing for the space she occupied. "You must be Silas Boone," she said, and her voice was like honey poured over gravel, feminine but big, filling the air in a way that made people turn and stare. She stuck out her hand, not daintily, but for a proper shake, the way men greeted each other. "Hello, husband." The crowd snickered. Silas heard it ripple through the onlookers like wind through grass, laughter poorly disguised as coughs, whispers that weren't quite whispered, the sound of judgment being passed without trial. He stood there, hat crushed in one hand, staring up. Up, God, he had to look up to meet her eyes. At this woman who bore no resemblance whatsoever to the delicate creature he'd imagined. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. Nora's smile flickered just for a moment. In that fraction of a second, Silas saw something beneath her confidence, a wound, old and familiar, the kind that came from a lifetime of being looked at the way people were looking at her now. He started, then stopped. What could he say? "You're not what I expected? You lied to me?" How could his words, already so inadequate, bridge the chasm that had opened between imagination and reality? Before he could finish the thought, Nora turned to the porter who was struggling with her luggage, 2 enormous trunks that looked like they'd been built to transport furniture. The man was red-faced, sweating, trying to get leverage under the first trunk without much success. "I'll get those," Nora said simply. She bent, grasped the iron handles of both trunks, both of them, each one probably weighing 100 pounds, and lifted them as easily as Silas might lift a pair of saddlebags. The porter's mouth fell open. The crowd's snickering stopped dead. Nora looked back at Silas, trunks hanging from her hands like children's toys. "Where's the wagon?" He pointed wordlessly. She nodded and started walking, her stride long and purposeful, boots raising small clouds of dust with each step. People parted before her the way they'd part before a freight wagon or a force of nature, not out of respect necessarily, but out of pure instinct for self-preservation. Silas stood frozen for 3 full seconds before his legs remembered how to move. He hurried after her, acutely aware of every eye following them, every whispered comment burning into his back. Behind him, he heard laughter building like thunder, not the good-natured kind, but the cruel sort that fed on other people's humiliation. At the wagon, Nora heaved both trunks into the bed with a single, smooth motion that would have taken 2 strong men considerable effort. Then she turned to face him again, and this time her smile was gone. In its place was something harder, more guarded. "I know what you're thinking," she said quietly. "I look nothing like what you imagined. I'm too big, too strong, too much everything. You want to call this off right now and send me back on the next train." Silas opened his mouth to protest, though whether to confirm or deny her assessment, he honestly didn't know. She held up one large hand. "Let me finish. I'm not what you ordered, that's true, but you're not what I ordered either." Her eyes traveled over him, taking in his small frame, his worn suit, the way he barely came up to her shoulder. There was no cruelty in her assessment, just honest appraisal. "We both did our best to make ourselves sound like something we're not, I suppose. Question is, what do we do now?" It was a fair question. They stood there in the June sunlight, 2 strangers bound by letters full of half-truths and a legal agreement that had seemed simple from a distance, but now loomed impossibly complex. Silas looked at her, really looked at her, and beneath his shock and fear and the weight of the town's judgment pressing down on his shoulders, he saw something that made him pause. She stood tall, yes, because there was no other way for her to stand. She was strong, undeniably. But in her eyes, behind the defensive hardness, he recognized the same thing he saw in his own mirror every morning, loneliness that had worn grooves into the soul, hope that kept trying despite every reason not to, and a desperate wish to be seen as something other than a disappointment. "I don't know," he admitted finally, the first honest thing he'd said since she stepped off the train. "But you came all this way. Least I can do is not make you ride back on an empty stomach." Something shifted in her face. Not quite relief, but the easing of some terrible tension. "That sounds like a start," she said. They climbed onto the wagon seat, Silas having to scramble up, while Nora stepped up in one smooth motion. He took up the reins, clucked to the horse, and they rolled out of Great Falls with half the town watching and the other half already spreading the story of the smallest cowboy and his giant mail-order bride. The first hour passed in silence so thick it felt like a living thing sitting between them. The wagon wheels creaked. The horses' hooves clopped. Meadowlarks called from fence posts. Silas kept his eyes on the road and tried not to think about the fact that the woman beside him took up more space on the wagon seat than he did, her solid presence making him feel even smaller than usual. Nora sat with her hands folded in her lap, watching the landscape roll past. Endless grassland punctuated by isolated stands of cottonwoods, mountains rising blue and distant in the west, sky so big it made the earth seem like an afterthought. After the crowded streets of St. Louis, this emptiness must have felt like exile. "It's beautiful," she said finally, breaking the silence. "Your letters didn't do it justice." "Hard to describe in words," Silas replied. "Sky's bigger here than anywhere else in the world." "I believe it." She was quiet for another moment, then, "In my letters I wasn't lying about everything. I do love to bake. I'm good at it too. And I do like wildflowers. Spent hours as a girl pressing them into books, learning all their names." "I wasn't lying either," Silas said. "Ranch is quiet. Life's simple. I do prefer solitude to crowds." "But not entirely alone." "No," he admitted. "Not entirely." She nodded as if this confirmed something. "I didn't lie about my disposition. I am gentle, mostly. Patient. I don't lose my temper easily, but I also didn't tell you—" She gestured at herself with one large hand. "Well, Obviously. Why not? The question hung between them. Nora was quiet for so long that Silas thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was lower, rougher. Because every time I do, every time I'm honest about what I am, men run, or laugh, or She trailed off. I've been engaged 3 times, Mr. Boone. 3 times. And 3 times, once they saw me in person, once they understood that I wasn't exaggerating or being modest, they found reasons to call it off. The last one's mother told him no man wants to wake up next to a draft horse. He agreed with her. The words hit Silas like a physical blow. He thought about his own omissions, his own fears. I'm not exactly what I presented either, he said quietly. My letters made it sound like I chose this life, like solitude was a preference, not a... He struggled for the word. Penance? Nora supplied. Punishment, he corrected, for being too small, too weak, too... Scared? He jerked his head around to look at her, but there was no mockery in her face, only understanding. How did you... Because I've been scared every day of my life, Mr. Boone. Scared that I'm too much, that I take up too much space, need too much, am too much of everything good women aren't supposed to be. She looked at him directly now. I thought maybe if I could get far enough away, to a place where nobody knew me, I could just be normal, or at least pretend to be. And now? Now I realize there's no running from what you are. Her smile was sad. I'll always be too big, you'll always be too small. Question is whether we're fool enough to think 2 wrongs might make something right. It was harsh, but honest. Silas appreciated the honesty. He'd had enough of lies, even the gentle ones people told themselves. My ranch is 12 miles out, he said. By the time we get there, we'll both know if this is a mistake. And if it is, then I'll take you back to town tomorrow and pay for your ticket home. I'm not a rich man, but I'm not a cruel one either. Nora nodded slowly. Fair enough? They rode on. The landscape changed gradually as they left the valley, grassland giving way to rolling hills dotted with pine, then to rougher country where sandstone formations rose like ancient sentinels. The afternoon sun beat down with the particular intensity of high summer in Montana, and Silas watched from the corner of his eye as Nora removed her bonnet, then loosened the collar of her dress, seemingly unconcerned with propriety. Sweat beaded on her forehead, darkened the fabric under her arms, but she didn't complain. You're used to hard work, he observed. Farm girl, she said. Born and raised in Missouri. My father had wheat fields and a small dairy. I was milking cows and hauling water by the time I was 8. She flexed one large hand. These aren't needlework hands, whatever my letters suggested. But you can sew? Well enough to keep myself clothed. Not well enough to make a living at it, or to impress anybody's mother-in-law. She said this last part with a bitter edge. Silas thought about his own hands, small, work-roughened, scarred from barbed wire and rope burns, and 100 small ranch injuries. My mother died when I was 12, he said. Never had a mother-in-law to impress. I'm sorry. Long time ago. He paused. My father died 3 years later, left the ranch to me and my brother. We worked it together until... He stopped. Until? The word hung there, heavy with an invitation to truth. Silas gripped the reins tighter. Until he died too, 6 years ago. Since then, it's just been me. Nora didn't push for details. Instead, she said, I'm sorry, that's a lot of alone. It is, he admitted. And suddenly, inexplicably, he wanted her to understand. That's why I wrote to the matrimonial column. Not because I wanted a wife exactly, because I was tired of talking to cattle and ghosts. Do the ghosts talk back? More than I'd like. She nodded as if this made perfect sense. My ghosts are different. They tell me I should be smaller, quieter, less. They sound like every man who ever looked at me and saw something wrong instead of something right. Maybe we're haunted by different things, Silas said, but haunted all the same. Maybe, Nora agreed. They crested a rise, and suddenly there it was, Silas's ranch spread out in the valley below. It wasn't much. A small cabin, a barn in need of repair, a corral, a few outbuildings. Cattle grazed on the hillside beyond, maybe 40 head, not enough to make a man rich, but sufficient to survive. A creek ran through the property, lined with willows that provided the only real shade for miles. Nora took it all in silently. Silas tried to see it through her eyes. The isolation, the rough simplicity, the utter lack of anything resembling civilization or comfort. No neighbors within 5 miles, no school, no church, no society, just wind and grass and mountains that watched indifferently as humans struggled against the land's relentless demands. "It's honest," Nora said finally. "Exactly what you described. A place for someone who wants to be left alone." "Or someone who needed to leave and never found a reason to come back," Silas replied. She glanced at him. "Are you talking about you or me?" "Maybe both." They drove down into the valley as the sun started its long slide toward the western peaks. By the time they reached the cabin, shadows stretched long and purple across the grass. Silas helped Nora down from the wagon, or rather, she climbed down herself before he could figure out how to help someone who didn't need it, and together they unloaded her trunks onto the porch. The cabin door stood open as he'd left it. Silas gestured toward it awkwardly. "It's not much. One room, mostly. I built a small addition last year, so there's a separate space for sleeping, but..." Nora ducked, literally ducked, through the doorway. At 6 feet tall, she was too large for the frame Silas had built to his own proportions. Inside, she looked around at the space that had seemed adequate for one small man and now appeared almost comically insufficient for her presence. There was a table with one chair, a narrow bed in the alcove, a cast-iron stove, shelves holding canned goods and a few books, a single window looking west toward the mountains. Everything was clean but spare, functional but colorless, the home of someone who'd stopped seeing it years ago. Nora turned in a slow circle, taking it all in. When she spoke, her voice was gentle. "It's not made for company." "Neither was I," Silas admitted. She smiled at that, and for the first time since stepping off the train, it reached her eyes. "Well, Mr. Boone, it seems we're both about to learn some new skills." That night they maintained a careful distance, moving around each other like planets in separate orbits. Nora insisted on cooking. "If I'm to live here, I might as well make myself useful." And produced from her trunk ingredients Silas hadn't seen in years. Real butter, dried fruit, spices that made the cabin smell like something other than loneliness and coffee. She made flapjacks, thick and golden, and scrambled eggs with what appeared to be actual herbs. When she tried to stand up straight while flipping a flapjack, she cracked her head on one of the low beams, a solid thunk that made Silas wince. But instead of cursing or crying, Nora laughed. A real laugh, deep and genuine, that started in her belly and rolled out like thunder across a valley. "Well," she said, rubbing her head, "I guess I know where all the obstacles are now." Silas found himself grinning despite everything. "Might want to catalog them. There's a few more." They ate at the small table, Nora standing, there was only one chair, and Silas sitting. The flapjacks were the best thing he'd tasted in 6 years. When he said so, Nora flushed with obvious pleasure. "Food tastes better when it's for someone," she said quietly. After dinner, they negotiated sleeping arrangements with excruciating awkwardness. Nora insisted she could sleep in the barn. "I've slept in worse." But Silas's mother hadn't raised him to put women in barns, mail order or otherwise. Finally, they agreed that she'd take the bed and he'd sleep on bedrolls by the stove. It was temporary, they assured each other, until they figured things out. As darkness fell and they lay on opposite sides of the small cabin, Nora spoke into the shadows. "Mr. Boone?" "Silas," he said. "If we're going to try this, you should call me Silas." "All right, Silas. Do you think we made a mistake?" He thought about the question, about her laughter when she hit her head, about the flapjacks, about the way she'd lifted those trunks while grown men struggled, about the loneliness that had driven them both to lie to strangers in matrimonial columns. "I think," he said slowly, "we made the same mistake everyone makes. We thought we could become something we're not. But maybe the real mistake would be giving up before we figure out what we actually are. And what are we, do you think?" "Two people who don't fit," Silas said, trying to figure out if there's a place where not fitting might be exactly right. Nora was quiet for so long he thought she'd fallen asleep. Then, so softly, he almost missed it. "I'd like to try to find that place." "Me too," Silas whispered into the darkness. Outside, the Montana night settled in with its symphony of distant coyotes and wind through grass. Inside the cabin, two people who'd never expected to find each other lay awake, separated by 12 feet of rough pine floor and a lifetime of disappointments, wondering if maybe, just maybe, they'd been wrong about what they needed all along. Morning came with the particular golden clarity that only exists in the high country, light spilling through the single window like liquid hope. Silas woke to the sound of someone moving around the cabin. Nora, already up, trying to be quiet, and failing because she was simply too large for quiet movements in a space designed for someone half her size. He watched her through half-closed eyes as she tried to navigate making coffee without hitting her head again, bending and adjusting and finally just kneeling by the stove because it was easier than constant ducking. There was something both heartbreaking and deeply practical about the way she'd already learned to accommodate the space rather than expecting it to accommodate her. "I'm awake," he said finally. "You don't have to whisper." She looked over her shoulder, and he was struck again by how beautiful she was when she smiled. "Old habit. My father always said I moved like a bull in a tea shop. Learned early to try for quiet." "This is a ranch," Silas said, sitting up. "Bulls are welcome here." It was meant as a joke, but Nora's expression shifted into something complicated. "We'll see how welcome I am when your neighbors get a look at me. How long before they start asking what possessed you to marry a woman who could probably pick you up and carry you around like a sack of flour?" "Could you?" "What?" "Pick me up like a sack of flour." She stared at him. "I suppose so. I mean, you don't weigh much more than—" She stopped. "Are you testing me?" "Curious," Silas admitted. "I weigh about 140. That much?" Nora's laugh was surprised and genuine. "I've hauled hay bales heavier than that, Silas Boone." "Huh," he said, standing and reaching for his boots. "That's actually impressive." "It's mortifying," she corrected. "No man wants a wife who's stronger than him." "Maybe no man you've met before," Silas replied. Then, because he could see she didn't believe him. "Look, I'm not saying I'm happy about being small. I'm not. I've spent my whole life being underestimated, ignored, or just plain looked past. But I learned a long time ago that strength comes in different shapes. You're strong with your back and arms. Maybe I need to be strong in other ways." "Like what?" He thought about it while pulling on his boots. "Like knowing when to ask for help. Like not being too proud to admit I can't do everything myself. Like—" He hesitated. "Like maybe not dying alone in a cabin built for one." The honesty surprised them both. Nora turned back to the stove, but not before he saw her blinking rapidly. "I woke you with that head bump last night," he said, changing the subject to give her space. "You were already awake when I was planning to start day's work." "City habits," she said. "In St. Louis, I worked at a bakery. We started at 4 in the morning to have bread ready when shops opened." "You worked in a bakery?" "For 3 years. After my father died and I couldn't keep the farm going alone. It wasn't respectable work for someone pretending to be a lady, but it was honest and I was good at it." She poured coffee into 2 tin cups. "The owner wanted to marry me, actually." "Why didn't you?" "He was 73 and had 9 grandchildren, 3 of whom were older than me. He wanted a wife who could run the bakery and care for him in his decline. I wanted—" She trailed off. "What?" "Something more than being useful," she finished quietly. "Is that selfish?" "If it is, then I'm just as selfish," Silas said, "because I wanted the same thing." They drank their coffee on the porch as the sun climbed higher and the day's heat began to build. Silas pointed out the boundaries of his property, explained his routine, checking cattle, mending fences, the endless small repairs that kept a ranch functioning. Nora listened carefully, asking questions that showed she understood ranch work better than her letters had suggested. "I can help," she offered. "I'm not afraid of work." I can see that." He hesitated. "But first, I need to build you a chair." "What?" "A real chair. One that fits you." He gestured at the porch's rough boards. "Can't have you standing through every meal or sitting on the floor like you're being punished. It's not right." Something shifted in Nora's expression. A softening, a breaking down of some defensive wall. "No one's ever offered to build me furniture before," she said. Usually they just suggest I learn to take up less space. Taking up space isn't a character flaw, Silas replied. He meant it. He spent that morning in the barn working with lumber he'd had stored for winter repairs. Carpentry had never been his strongest skill, but he understood the basics, and he had time. More importantly, he had motivation. The memory of Nora standing through breakfast, the way she'd tried to fold herself smaller to fit his inadequate furniture. While he worked, she explored the ranch. He'd catch glimpses of her through the barn door, walking the creek line, examining the cattle with a practiced eye, inspecting the sorry state of his vegetable garden with what looked like professional dismay. She moved with the confidence of someone used to outdoor work, her long stride covering ground quickly, seemingly unbothered by the heat. Around noon, he heard shouting. Silas dropped his hammer and ran outside to find Nora standing in the middle of his pasture, facing down his prized Angus bull. Thunder, 2,000 pounds of muscle and bad temper, who'd won him second place at the county fair 3 years running. The bull was snorting, pawing the ground, head lowered in that way that meant he was about 3 seconds from charging. Nora stood perfectly still. "Don't move," Silas shouted, running toward them. But Nora did move. She took a step forward, toward the bull, not away, and started humming. Low and steady, a tune Silas didn't recognize, something that sounded like a lullaby mixed with a work song. She held out one large hand, palm down, and kept humming. Thunder stopped pawing. His head came up slightly, ears forward. Nora took another step. Still humming. Still calm as morning dew. The bull, this creature that had sent 3 grown men scrambling over fences in the past year, who was too mean to sell and too valuable to shoot, lowered his head and walked up to Nora's outstretched hand like a dog coming for a pat. She scratched between his horns. Thunder's eyes half closed in what looked suspiciously like contentment. "Well," Silas breathed, stopping 20 feet away and trying not to break whatever spell she'd cast. "I'll be damned." Nora glanced over at him, still scratching the bull's massive head. "He's not mean. He's just misunderstood. Probably been handled rough, treated like a threat instead of a creature with feelings. He gored a fence post last month because someone scared him or made him feel trapped." She kept her voice low, soothing. "Animals are simple, Silas. They respond to how you treat them. You come at them with fear, they give you fear back. You come at them with calm." She shrugged. "They remember what calm feels like." Thunder made a sound that was almost a purr, if a 2,000-pound bull could purr. "How did you learn that?" Silas asked, approaching slowly now that the danger seemed past. "Same way I learned everything else. Trial and error, mostly. When you're my size, animals either fear you or trust you completely. There's no middle ground." She gave Thunder a final pat and stepped back. The bull watched her go but didn't follow, just stood there looking almost disappointed that the attention had ended. "That," Silas said, "was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I've ever seen." "Probably both," Nora admitted. "But your bull was distressed about something. I could hear him bellowing from the creek. Figured I should see what was wrong before he hurt himself or your fences." They walked back to the barn together, Thunder following at a respectful distance like a pet rather than a threat. Silas kept glancing between the bull and the woman, trying to reconcile what he'd just witnessed with everything he thought he knew about cattle and courage. "In your letters," he said finally, "you mentioned being gentle. I thought you meant—" He gestured vaguely. "You thought I meant delicate, sweet, dainty?" Nora's smile was knowing. "I meant I understand gentleness as strength, not weakness. I meant I know how to handle things bigger and stronger than me without breaking them or myself. That's not what most people mean by gentle." "I'm not most people," she replied. "I thought we'd established that." They had. And standing there in the Montana sunlight with his supposedly vicious bull following this enormous woman like she was the Pied Piper of cattle, Silas felt something shift in his chest. Not love, not yet, but the first green shoot of possibility, pushing up through hard ground the way Nora had described wildflowers doing in her letters. Maybe, he thought, 2 people who didn't fit anywhere else might fit together after all. Not because they were perfect, but because they'd both learned that survival sometimes meant becoming something entirely different than what the world expected, and strong enough to live with the consequences. That evening, when the sun had mellowed into long amber light that painted everything golden, Silas carried the chair he'd built out to the porch. It wasn't fancy, rough pine planed smooth, joints reinforced with extra dowels, seat wide enough for Nora's frame and back tall enough to support her properly. He'd carved nothing decorative into it, added no embellishments. It was simply a chair built for the person who would sit in it, honest in its purpose. Nora came around from the garden where she'd spent the afternoon pulling weeds and replanting vegetables with the kind of systematic efficiency that suggested she'd done it 1,000 times before. She stopped when she saw what he'd set on the porch, her hands still dirty from the soil, her face showing the kind of surprise that comes when someone expects nothing and receives something. "You built it," she said softly. "Said I would." Silas gestured toward it. "Go on. Make sure it holds." She approached the chair the way someone might approach something holy or breakable, with a carefulness that made Silas's throat tight. When she lowered herself onto it, slowly, as if expecting it to collapse or protest, and it held without creaking, without complaint, without making her feel like she needed to apologize for existing, something in her face crumpled. "It fits," she whispered. "It actually fits." "Of course it fits. Built it for you, didn't I?" But Nora was shaking her head, and when she looked up at him, her eyes were bright with tears she was trying hard not to shed. "You don't understand. I've never had a chair that fits, not since I was 12 years old. Every chair I've sat in since then has been too small, or too weak, or I've had to perch on the edge trying not to break it. I've spent half my life standing or sitting on the floor because it was easier than watching furniture fail under me." Silas hadn't thought about that. The cumulative weight of 1,000 small rejections, the way something as simple as a chair could become a daily reminder that the world wasn't built for you. He sat down on the porch steps near her feet, looking up at where she sat comfortably for the first time since arriving. "First chair that doesn't make me feel too much," she murmured, running her hand along the armrest. "That's a gift I didn't know how to ask for." "You shouldn't have to ask," Silas said. "People should just pay attention." They sat together as twilight deepened, watching the valley fill with shadows and the first stars prick holes in the darkening sky. Somewhere across the pasture, thunder lowed contentedly. Night birds called to each other in languages older than human settlement. The creek whispered its endless conversation with stones. "Tell me about your brother," Nora said finally. "You mentioned him yesterday, said he died 6 years ago." Silas felt his whole body tense. It was the question he'd been dreading and expecting in equal measure, the wound he'd spent 6 years trying not to probe. But Nora had been honest with him about her rejections, her humiliations, the casual cruelties that had shaped her. Maybe he owed her the same. "His name was James," he started, the words coming slow and painful, like pulling arrows from old wounds. 3 years older than me. Bigger, stronger, better at everything ranching required. Our father always said James got the size and I got the sense, but that was just kindness talking. James had sense too, more than I did anyway. "You worked the ranch together?" "From the time we were boys until the night he died. We were a good team. He could do the heavy work, I handled the books and the planning. Made a whole person between us," our father used to joke. Silas picked at a splinter on the porch step. "After our parents died, it was just the two of us." That was enough. More than enough. Nora waited, not pushing, just present. 6 years ago, we had trouble with rustlers," Silas continued, his voice going flat the way it always did when he told this part. "They'd been hitting ranches up and down the valley, stealing cattle in the night. Everyone knew they'd come for us eventually. We weren't big enough to post guards, weren't rich enough to hire protection. James said we should take turns staying awake, watching. I was supposed to take first watch that night. The stars were fully out now. The Milky Way spilled across the sky like someone had kicked over a bucket of light. Silas kept his eyes on those stars because looking at Nora, at her sympathy, would break something inside him that needed to stay whole. "I fell asleep," he said simply. "Sat down with my rifle, told myself I'd just rest my eyes for a minute, and I fell asleep. When I woke up, there were gunshots. 4 men in our pasture, loading our cattle into a wagon. James running toward them, shouting, trying to stop them alone because his fool brother was sleeping instead of watching. Silas, they shot him," he continued, the words coming faster now, like poison he needed to purge. 3 times. And I just stood there. I had my rifle. I could have fired back. Could have done something, anything, but I froze. I was too scared, too small, too useless. I just stood there in the dark while my brother bled out in the pasture. And by the time I finally moved, finally ran to him, it was too late. He died in my arms, asking me why I didn't help him. The silence that followed was enormous. Silas felt the weight of his confession settle around them like snow, muffling everything, making the world feel distant and unreal. "That's why you're alone," Nora said finally. Not a question. "That's why I deserve to be alone," Silas corrected. James was everything good about this ranch, about our family, and I let him die because I was too weak to stay awake, too cowardly to fight. Everyone in the valley knows it. They don't say it to my face, but they know. The sheriff caught 2 of the rustlers a week later. They hanged them in Great Falls. Justice served. Case closed. But it doesn't matter because James is still dead, and I'm still the brother who failed him. Nora was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that surprised him. "Did your brother know you loved him?" "What?" "Before he died. Did James know you loved him? That you'd have traded places with him in a heartbeat? That you'd give anything, your life, your soul, everything, to undo that night?" Yes. Of course he knew." "Then you didn't fail him," Nora said firmly. "You failed yourself, maybe. You made a mistake, a terrible human mistake. But love? Love you got right. And that's the part that matters most in the end. It doesn't." Silas struggled to find words. "He's still dead, Nora. My mistake, my weakness, my cowardice killed him just as surely as those bullets did." "No," she said, and there was steel in her voice now. "Those rustlers killed him. You being asleep didn't pull the trigger. You being scared didn't load the gun. You made a mistake, yes, but you're not the villain of this story, Silas. You're just the one left behind to carry guilt that isn't yours to carry." "The valley doesn't see it that way." "The valley doesn't matter," Nora replied. "The valley didn't love James, you did. And you've spent 6 years punishing yourself for being human, for having limits, for not being able to single-handedly fight off 4 armed men. That's not justice, that's just cruelty." Silas felt something crack inside his chest, some barrier he'd built between himself and grief, between guilt and grace. "I should have saved him," he whispered. "I should have been stronger." "And I should be smaller," Nora said quietly. "I should take up less space, need less, be less." But should doesn't feed the cattle, Silas. Should doesn't plant gardens or build chairs or calm, angry bulls. Should is just another way to hate ourselves for not being something we never could be. She stood up from her chair, the one built for her, and came to sit beside him on the steps. In the darkness, with the stars watching and the mountain wind carrying away the day's heat, she took his small hand in her large one. "I don't know if what we're doing here will work," she said. "I don't know if 2 broken people can build something whole. But I know that carrying shame alone is killing you the same way being too big to love was killing me. Maybe we can't fix each other. Maybe that's not even the point. But maybe we can at least share the weight." Silas looked at their joined hands, his rough and small, hers broad and strong, different in every way except that they were both scarred by work and marked by survival. "I don't know how to stop feeling guilty," he admitted. "Then don't stop," Nora replied. "Not yet. Just make room for something else alongside it. Room for the fact that you're still here, still trying, still decent enough to build a chair for a woman you barely know because you noticed she had nowhere to sit. That counts for something, Silas. It has to." They sat like that until the moon rose, 2 people trading truths in the darkness, testing whether honesty could be a foundation for something more solid than the lies they'd told in letters. When they finally went inside, neither of them mentioned that they'd held hands, or that some boundary between strangers and something else had been crossed, or that the cabin felt somehow less empty than it had the night before. The next morning dawned with trouble. Silas woke to pounding on his door and angry voices. He stumbled out of his bedroll, still half asleep, to find 3 of his neighbors standing on his porch, with the particular expressions men wear when they've come to deliver bad news and enjoy it. Boone, said Tom Hutchins, no relation to Nora despite the shared name, a rancher who owned the spread 2 miles north. He was a thick man with a thick mustache and the kind of confidence that came from being right-sized for the world. Your bull's out, tore through my fence last night and scattered my herd halfway to Sunday. That's impossible, Silas said, trying to shake off sleep. Thunder's secure in the pasture. I checked before it. Don't care what you checked, Tom interrupted. I'm telling you, your damn bull is on my property causing havoc, and you're coming to get him before I shoot him and bill you for the meat. Silas was pulling on his boots when Nora emerged from the sleeping alcove, her hair loose and her dress hastily buttoned. The 3 men stopped talking immediately, staring at her with expressions ranging from shock to poorly disguised amusement. Lord Almighty, breathed Pete Morrison, the youngest of the 3. The stories weren't exaggerating. Shut your mouth, Pete, Tom said, but his eyes were on Nora too, assessing, judging. Mrs. Boone, I presume? Miss Hutchins, Nora corrected coolly. We haven't formalized the marriage yet. And you are? Tom Hutchins, your neighbor to the north. These are Pete Morrison and Frank Chen. We've come about Boone's bull. I heard, Nora said. I'll come with you. That's not, Tom started. I said I'll come with you, Nora repeated, and there was something in her voice that ended the discussion. Give me 2 minutes to make myself presentable. She disappeared back into the alcove. The 3 men looked at Silas with expressions he'd learned to read years ago, pity mixed with mockery, the particular look men give other men who've failed at something basic like choosing an appropriate wife. You actually went through with it, Pete said, trying for a joking tone and missing. Married the giantess. We're not married yet, Silas said tightly, finishing with his boots. Smart man, Frank said. He was the oldest of the 3. A Chinese immigrant who'd worked his way up from railroad labor to ranch ownership through sheer determination. Normally, Silas respected him, but right now Frank was looking at him with something close to pity. Still time to reconsider before you're legally bound to that. Silas felt anger kindle in his chest, hot and defensive. That is a woman with a name and more courage than any of you showed when you didn't bother helping track down the men who killed my brother. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Tom's face reddened. Pete looked away. Frank, at least, had the decency to look ashamed. That was uncalled for, Tom said finally. Was it? Silas replied. You've been neighborly enough when it suited you, Tom. But now you're standing on my porch making jokes about my business when you should be worried about your own cattle. Nora reappeared, properly dressed now, her hair pulled back severely. She looked each man in the eye as she passed them, her gaze steady and unintimidated. Shall we go, gentlemen? Your cattle won't gather themselves. They rode to Tom's ranch in awkward silence. Silas and Nora in his wagon, the 3 men on horseback ranging ahead. When they arrived, the damage was evident. Tom's fence had indeed been trampled, rails broken and scattered, and his cattle were spread across 2 pastures instead of 1. In the middle of the chaos stood Thunder, looking pleased with himself and not at all repentant. There, Tom said, pointing. Your bull. Now get him out of here before he does more damage. I'll handle it, Nora said, climbing down from the wagon. Ma'am, I don't think, Pete started. But Nora was already walking toward Thunder, that same calm confidence she'd shown yesterday, her hands loose at her sides and her voice starting that low, steady hum. The bull's head came up, his ears swiveled forward. When Nora was 10 feet away, Thunder walked to her like a dog called home. She grasped his halter. When had she put a halter on him? Silas didn't remember Thunder wearing one yesterday and led him toward the broken fence. The bull followed docilely, completely ignoring Tom's scattered cattle, focused entirely on the woman leading him. The 4 men watched in stunned silence. I'll be damned, Frank muttered. How is she doing that? Pete asked. Tom said nothing, but his expression had shifted from mockery to something more complex, respect perhaps, or the beginning of it. Nora led Thunder through the broken fence and back toward Silas's wagon. When she reached it, she tied the bull's lead to the back and turned to face Tom with the kind of dignity that made her size irrelevant. Your fence, she said calmly, was poorly maintained. 3 rails had wrought damage and the posts weren't sunk deep enough. A strong wind could have knocked it down, never mind a curious bull. I'll help repair it properly this afternoon, but you should know that blaming your own poor maintenance on someone else's livestock is cowardly. Tom's face went from red to purple. Now you listen here. No, Nora interrupted, her voice still calm but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. You listen. Your fence failed because you didn't maintain it. Thunder got out because he could smell your cattle and wanted company. That's animal behavior, not malice. Silas and I will help you repair the damage because that's what neighbors do. But we won't accept blame for your negligence. And we won't tolerate disrespect because you're embarrassed that a woman noticed what you overlooked. The silence that followed felt dangerous. Silas held his breath, waiting to see if Tom would explode, if this would turn into the kind of conflict that ended with violence or lawyers, or both. Instead, Frank started laughing, deep, genuine laughter that broke the tension like a hammer through ice. She's right, Tom, Frank said, still chuckling. That fence has been needing repair for 2 years. We've all told you. Now a lady points it out and suddenly you want to shoot the messenger, or the bull. Tom looked like he wanted to argue, but Pete was nodding agreement, and even he couldn't deny the visible rot on the broken rails. Finally, he deflated slightly, the anger draining into something closer to grudging acceptance. Fine, he muttered. Fence needs work, but your bull still broke it. And we'll help fix it, Silas said, finding his voice again. This afternoon. Nora and I both. I don't need a woman's help, Tom started. Then you don't need anyone's help, Nora said simply. Because I'm the one who knows how to repair fences properly. Silas can assist me, and you can watch and learn, or you can refuse help out of pride and continue having fence failures. Your choice. It was beautifully done, offering assistance while making clear she wouldn't beg for the privilege of helping, wouldn't diminish herself to make Tom feel comfortable with his own inadequacy. Silas felt something swell in his chest that might have been pride or might have been something deeper. Tom looked at his friends for support and found none. Finally, he nodded once, sharp and begrudging. Afternoon then, and I suppose I spoke hastily earlier, about the bull. It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was as close as men like Tom Hutchins got to admitting fault. They returned to Silas's ranch with Thunder trailing contentedly behind the wagon. Once the bull was secured, in a reinforced section of fence that Silas now realized probably needed work itself, Nora started gathering tools and materials for the afternoon's repairs. You didn't have to do that, Silas said as they worked. Defend me, I mean, or offer to help Tom after he insulted us both. Yes, I did, Nora replied, testing the weight of a post-hole digger. Not because you needed defending, you handled yourself fine, but because people like Tom need to learn that being wrong isn't the end of the world, and accepting help from unexpected sources isn't weakness. He called you a giantess. He did, she agreed calmly. Pete did, actually. Tom just thought it. But I've been called worse by better people, Silas. Words only have the power you give them. Doesn't it hurt? She paused, considering. Of course it hurts. Every time. But I can either spend my life hurt by what people say, or I can spend it proving them wrong by living well despite their opinions. The second option seems more productive. They loaded the wagon with tools and fresh-cut rails from Silas's stockpile. As they worked, Silas found himself watching Nora with new appreciation. The efficient way she moved, the practical knowledge she clearly possessed about ranch work, the quiet strength that had nothing to do with muscle and everything to do with refusing to be diminished. That story you told last night, Nora said as they worked. About your brother. Have you ever told anyone else? The sheriff. Had to, for the investigation. I mean really told. The way you told me, with the guilt and the fear and the parts that make you feel small. Silas shook his head. Wasn't anyone to tell. And even if there was, what man wants to admit he was too cowardly to save his own brother? A man who's honest, Nora replied. A man who understands that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting despite it. You froze once in a moment of terror. That doesn't define your whole life unless you let it. Easy to say. Nothing about it is easy, she countered, but necessary things rarely are. They arrived at Tom's ranch to find him and his 2 friends already working on the fence, or rather, arguing about how to work on it. When Nora approached and began giving clear, specific instructions, this post needed replacing entirely, that rail could be salvaged if they reinforced it here, the whole line needed to be realigned to account for the slope. The men gradually stopped arguing and started listening. Silas watched something remarkable happen over the next 3 hours. Nora didn't just fix Tom's fence, she taught him why it had failed and how to prevent future failures. She explained the principles of load distribution, showed him how to test for rot, demonstrated proper post-setting techniques. And Tom, despite his initial resistance, began to listen. Not because she demanded his attention, but because her competence was undeniable. By late afternoon, when the fence stood straight and strong with new rails gleaming pale against weathered wood, even Tom had to admit it was better than what had been there before. "You learned this from your father?" he asked Nora as they packed up tools. "Learned it from necessity," she replied. "When you're a woman alone trying to keep a farm running after your father dies, you learn quick or you starve. I learned." Tom nodded slowly, something shifting in how he looked at her. Not admiration yet, but at least respect. "Well, thanks for the help, both of you." It was small, but it was something. Riding home in the twilight, with Thunder secured properly in his pasture and Tom's fence standing strong behind them, Silas felt lighter than he had in days. Maybe years. "You were magnificent today," he said quietly. Nora glanced at him, surprised. "I fixed a fence, Silas. Nothing magnificent about it." "You fixed more than a fence," he replied. "You fixed the way Tom looked at both of us, at me, for bringing you here, at you, for being who you are. That's not nothing." She was quiet for a moment, then, "Do you regret it? Bringing me here?" "No," Silas said, and realized he meant it completely. "I regret lying in my letters about what I wanted. I regret making you feel like you had to lie too, but I don't regret that you came. Not anymore." "Anymore?" "I was terrified when you stepped off that train," he admitted. "Terrified of what people would think, what it meant about me that I couldn't attract someone more conventional. But these past 2 days, watching you with Thunder, with Tom, with everything this place throws at you, I'm starting to think maybe I got exactly what I needed, even if it wasn't what I thought I wanted." Nora's smile was small but genuine. "That might be the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me." "Then people haven't been paying attention." They reached the ranch as full dark settled in, the cabin windows glowing warm with lamplight Silas had left burning that morning. For the first time since James died, coming home didn't feel like returning to a mausoleum of grief. It felt like coming home to something living, something that might grow into more than just survival. That night, after a simple dinner and quiet conversation about fence repair and bull behavior, they sat together on the porch, Nora in her chair, Silas on the steps, and watched the stars wheel overhead. "Tell me something true," Nora said suddenly. "Something you've never told anyone." Silas thought about it. "I'm afraid," he said finally. "Every day. Afraid I'll fail again like I failed James. Afraid I'm not strong enough or big enough or brave enough for this life. Afraid that one day something will happen that requires more than I can give, and someone else will die because I'm not enough." "That's not fear," Nora said gently. "That's trauma. Fear passes. Trauma lives in your bones and tells you lies about who you are." "What lies does yours tell you?" She considered. "That I'm unlovable. That taking up space is a sin I'll spend my life apologizing for. That the reason men reject me isn't about them or their limitations. It's because there's something fundamentally wrong with me that I can't fix by wanting hard enough." "Those are lies," Silas said firmly. "So are yours," she replied. They sat with that truth between them, two people beginning to see each other clearly, scars and all, and choosing not to look away. "I think," Nora said slowly, "that maybe we could help each other tell better stories, not about being perfect or fixed, but about being enough exactly as we are." "I'd like that," Silas replied. "I don't know how, but I'd like to try." "Then that's where we start," Nora said. "With trying, with being honest, with building chairs and fixing fences and calming bulls and all the small, ordinary ways people show up for each other." Somewhere in the darkness, Thunder lowed contentedly in his reinforced pasture. The creek sang its endless song. The Montana night wrapped around them like a blanket, vast and indifferent, and somehow, in its very vastness, forgiving. Inside the cabin, two beds waited, still separate, still maintaining that careful distance of new acquaintance. But on the porch, their hands found each other in the darkness, and for a moment before they went inside, they held on like people who'd been drowning and suddenly found solid ground. It wasn't love yet. But it was the foundation love might grow from if they could learn to be honest and gentle with each other's wounds, if they could make space for healing alongside their fear, if they could accept that two imperfect people might build something stronger than either could manage alone. That night, lying in their separate spaces, neither of them slept right away. Instead, they listened to each other breathe across the small cabin, finding comfort in the sound of not being alone, of having witnessed and been witnessed, of taking the first real steps toward becoming something neither had planned but both desperately needed, partners in survival, companions in honesty, and maybe eventually something more. The days that followed Tom's fence repair brought a shift in how the valley saw them, subtle but unmistakable. Word traveled fast in ranching country, and the story of how Nora Bell Hutchins had diagnosed fence failure led a 2,000-pound bull like a house pet and taught Tom Hutchins carpentry in his own pasture, spread through the territory like smoke on wind. People still stared when they came to town, but now the stares carried something closer to curiosity than mockery. Silas noticed it first at the feed store, where old Marcus Webb actually tipped his hat to Nora instead of pretending she didn't exist. Then at the post office, where the clerk asked her opinion on dealing with a stubborn mule. Small things, perhaps, but in a community that measured worth by usefulness and respected competence above convention, these small acknowledgments meant everything. But acceptance from strangers was easier than the deeper work happening between them. They were still learning each other's rhythms, still navigating the strange intimacy of shared space and separate histories. Silas would wake before dawn to find Nora already up, kneading bread dough with the methodical patience of someone who found comfort in routine. She'd catch him staring at James's photograph on the shelf, his face gone distant and haunted, and she'd wait until he returned to the present before speaking. They were dancing around something neither knew how to name, this careful courtship of two wounded people testing whether trust could be built on honesty instead of pretty lies. 3 weeks after her arrival, on a morning that dawned clear and hot with summer's full weight, Silas came in from checking the cattle to find Nora sitting at the table with his ledger book open before her, her face troubled. "I hope you don't mind," she said, gesturing to the accounts. "I was looking for paper to make a shopping list, and I found these. Silas, these numbers don't make sense." He felt defensive heat rise in his chest. "I manage fine." "I'm not saying you don't," she replied carefully, "but according to this, you sold 40 head last fall and bought supplies for 60. Your winter feed costs are higher than your income, and you've got 3 months of missed payments to the bank for—" She ran her finger down the column. "For what exactly? There's no notation." Silas sat down heavily across from her, suddenly exhausted. This was the conversation he'd been dreading, the truth he'd been avoiding by keeping busy with fence repairs and daily chores. "It's the loan I took to hire the Pinkertons," he said finally. "Pinkertons?" "Private investigators. After James died, I hired them to track down the other 2 rustlers. The sheriff caught 2, but there were 4 that night. I needed to find them." His hands clenched on the table. "Needed them to pay for what they did." Nora's expression shifted to understanding. "Did they find them?" "Found one. Dead already. Killed in a bar fight in Wyoming. The other disappeared into Canada, or Mexico, or hell for all I know." Silas laughed bitterly. "Spent $500 to learn that revenge doesn't bring anyone back, and justice is mostly just expensive. And now you can't make the payments." "Been scraping by. Selling cattle I shouldn't sell. Eating less, letting repairs wait." He met her eyes. "That's part of why I wrote to the matrimonial column. Thought maybe if I had help, a partner, I could dig out from under this debt before the bank forecloses." The silence that followed felt heavy with judgment he was certain was coming. He'd essentially admitted to marrying her, or trying to marry her, for financial survival as much as companionship. It was mercenary and shameful and exactly the kind of truth that could break whatever fragile thing was building between them. "How much do you owe?" Nora asked finally. $300. Might as well be 3,000 for all the chance I have of paying it. She nodded slowly, stood up, and walked to her trunk in the corner. From beneath her carefully folded dresses, she pulled out a small leather pouch, heavy with the unmistakable weight of coins. She set it on the table between them. "There's $340 in there," she said. "Money I saved working at the bakery, plus what my father's farm sold for after he died. I brought it because I knew starting a new life would require resources, and I didn't want to come to a husband as a burden." Silas stared at the pouch like it was a snake. "I can't take your money." "I'm not giving it to you," Nora replied. "I'm investing it in our survival. This ranch, if we're staying here together, it's as much mine now as yours. And ranches can't survive under crushing debt any more than people can. Nora, that's everything you have. Your security. What if this doesn't work between us? What if the sun doesn't rise tomorrow?" she interrupted. "What if thunder learns to fly? What if asking what if is just another way to stay stuck in fear?" She pushed the pouch toward him. "I choose to believe we're building something here. That means investing in our foundation, not hoarding security against the possibility of failure. That's not practical. Neither is slowly losing your ranch while sitting on money that could save it." Her voice was firm but not unkind. "Silas, I spent 3 years saving this money 1 penny at a time, getting up at 4 in the morning to make bread for people who looked past me like I was furniture. You think I did that so I could watch it sit in a trunk while you lose everything out of pride?" He wanted to argue, but the logic was undeniable. More than that, the gesture itself, her willingness to commit her entire savings to their shared survival, touched something deep in him that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with trust. "We'd be partners then," he said slowly. "True partners. Legally, I'd have to put your name on the deed. Is that a problem?" "No." He reached across and took her hand, large and work-worn, and somehow exactly right in his. "No, it's not a problem. It's probably the smartest thing I could do if you're willing." "I'm willing," Nora said, "on one condition." "Name it." "We go to town tomorrow and get properly married. Not because we have to, but because if I'm investing everything I have in this ranch, I want the legal protection that comes with being your wife. No more separate beds, no more pretending we're just testing things out. We commit, fully, and figure the rest out as we go." Silas felt his heart hammering. This was it, the moment when possibility became promise, when the careful dance ended and the real work began. He could say no, could insist they needed more time, more certainty, more proof that two broken people could build something whole. Or he could take the leap that Nora was offering, trust that maybe love didn't require perfection, only willingness. "Tomorrow," he agreed. "We'll go to town and get married, then we'll pay off the bank and start fresh. Partners in everything." Nora's smile was like sunrise after a long night. "Partners in everything," she echoed. They married the next afternoon in the Great Falls courthouse, with a justice of the peace who'd seen stranger matches and Marcus Webb from the feed store standing as their witness because he happened to be there filing a claim. It wasn't romantic or ceremonial. Nora wore her best gray dress, Silas wore his funeral suit, and the whole proceeding took less than 10 minutes. But when the justice said, "You may kiss your bride," and Silas had to stand on his toes while Nora bent down to meet him, when their lips touched for the first time and he tasted possibility, something fundamental shifted in both of them. This was real now, legal and binding, and absolutely terrifying in the best possible way. Afterward, they walked to the bank together, Nora's money pouch in Silas's pocket feeling heavier than gold. The bank manager, a thin man named Hutchinson who'd been growing increasingly insistent about missed payments, looked surprised to see them together. "Mr. Boone," he said, his tone carefully neutral, "and this must be the Mrs. Boone everyone's been talking about." "It is," Silas replied. "We've come to settle my account." He counted out $300 in coins and small bills, each one representing hours of Nora's labor, her sacrifice, her faith in their future. Hutchinson counted it twice, made notations in his ledger, and finally stamped a receipt with "paid in full" across the top. "Congratulations," Hutchinson said, and he seemed to mean it. "Clean slate, Mr. Boone, don't waste it." "I don't intend to," Silas replied, taking Nora's hand. "We don't intend to." Walking out of that bank into the bright afternoon sunshine, both of them lighter by $300 but heavier with commitment. Silas felt something he hadn't felt since before James died. Hope. Not the desperate, clawing hope that things might somehow get better, but the solid, foundational hope that came from having a partner, a plan, and a clean slate to write their future on. "What do we do now?" Nora asked as they climbed into the wagon. "Now," Silas said, "we go home and figure out how to be married." The ride back to the ranch was different than their first journey together. Then they'd been strangers pretending at possibility. Now they were bound by law and choice. And the silence between them felt less like awkwardness and more like the comfortable quiet of two people who didn't need to fill every moment with words. When they reached the cabin, Silas carried Nora's trunk from the sleeping alcove into the main room, their room now, though he'd need to build a bigger bed frame. She made dinner while he tended the evening chores, and when they sat down to eat, it was as husband and wife, partners in survival, two people who'd made vows and meant them even if neither was quite sure what came next. That night, lying together in the too-small bed with Nora curved against the wall and Silas perched on the edge trying not to fall off, both of them acutely aware of every breath and movement, Nora spoke into the darkness. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Of what?" "Of failing at this. Of being too much for you. Of waking up one day and seeing regret in your eyes." She paused. "Of you seeing who I really am and deciding I'm not worth the investment." Silas rolled over carefully to face her, though in the darkness he could barely make out her features. "I'm scared too," he said. "Scared I'm not enough. That I'll fail you the way I failed James. That my weakness will cost you everything you've given up to be here." "Then we're both scared," Nora said softly. "Maybe that's all right. Maybe courage isn't the absence of fear. It's being scared and choosing each other anyway." "I choose you," Silas whispered. "Every version of you. Too big, too strong, too honest. All of it." "I choose you too," she replied. "Too small, too haunted, too good at building chairs that fit. Every bit." They fell asleep like that, holding each other carefully in the darkness. Two people learning that intimacy wasn't about perfection. It was about showing up scared and choosing each other anyway. The summer wore on, hot and dry, testing the ranch and everyone on it. They fell into rhythms, Nora handling the garden and the heavier work that Silas's frame made difficult, Silas managing the accounts, and the detailed planning that ranch survival required. They learned each other's wounds and triggers, learned when to push and when to give space, learned the 1,000 small compromises that turned two individuals into a partnership. But they also learned joy. Nora taught Silas to dance one evening after supper, humming the tunes she remembered from church socials while they spun around the small cabin, laughing when he stepped on her feet, and she nearly put him through the wall trying to catch him. Silas taught her to read the weather in the way clouds formed over the mountains to predict rain or wind, or the clear, dangerous heat that made fire season deadly. They worked on expanding the cabin together, Nora's strength and Silas's planning combining to add a proper bedroom, a larger kitchen, a porch wide enough for 2 chairs. Neighbors who came by to help with the barn raising or fence repair no longer made jokes about their size difference. Or if they did, they made them where Nora couldn't hear, out of respect for her competence, if not her feelings. By August, the ranch was thriving in ways it hadn't since James's death. The cattle were healthy, the fences secure, the garden producing more vegetables than 2 people could eat. They sold the surplus in town, and Nora's preserves gained a reputation that had the general store asking if she could supply them regularly. Life wasn't perfect. Silas still woke sometimes in the night, trapped in dreams where James died over and over and he remained frozen, unable to help. Nora still flinched when people stared too long, still carried the weight of a lifetime being told she was too much, but they had each other to wake up to remind them that past wounds didn't have to dictate future worth. Then came the night that changed everything. It was late September, the air carrying the first whisper of autumn's cold, when Silas woke to thunder bellowing in distress. Not his usual calls, but something panicked, desperate. He was out of bed and pulling on pants before fully conscious, reaching for the rifle he kept by the door out of habit from years of vigilance that had failed him once. "What is it?" Nora asked, already up and dressing in the darkness. "Don't know. Stay here." "Absolutely not," she replied. reaching for the shotgun she'd had him teach her to use a month after arriving. "We're partners, remember? That means I don't hide while you face trouble alone." There was no time to argue. Silas lit a lantern and they moved outside together into the cold dark where Thunder's cries echoed off the mountains. The moon was nearly full, painting everything in silver and shadow, bright enough to see shapes, but not details. In the pasture, Thunder stood near the fence line, pawing the ground and tossing his head. Beyond him, near the tree line where the property bordered wilderness, Silas saw movement, multiple shapes, human-sized, moving with purpose toward the cattle. His blood turned to ice. He knew what he was seeing even before his conscious mind caught up. Rustlers. Again. 6 years later, and here they were, different men perhaps, but the same threat, the same nightmare made flesh. For a moment, terrible, infinite, Silas froze. His hands went numb on the rifle. His breath caught in his chest. The world narrowed to a pinpoint of panic where James bled out in his arms and he stood useless, too scared to act, too weak to matter. Then Nora's hand was on his shoulder, solid and real and present. "How many?" she asked, her voice calm and steady as mountain stone. The question broke through his paralysis. "4," he managed. "Maybe 5. "Can you shoot?" It was a fair question. Could he? Could the man who'd frozen once, failed catastrophically, trust himself to act when it mattered? Every instinct screamed that he'd fail again, that fear would lock his muscles and cloud his judgment, and someone would die because Silas Boone was too small, too weak, too broken to be relied upon. But Nora was here, his wife, his partner, and she was trusting him to be more than his worst moment. "Yes," he said, and meant it. "I can shoot." "Then we do this together," Nora replied. She raised her voice, projecting across the pasture with the kind of command that made men twice her size pay attention. "You men by the tree line! You're trespassing on private property. Leave now or face consequences." The shapes stopped moving. A moment of silence, then laughter, rough and male and full of the kind of cruelty that comes from men who've learned the world rewards violence. "That's a woman," one of them called back. "They got a woman guarding their cattle." "And a man," Silas shouted, stepping forward so they could see him clearly in the moonlight. "With a rifle and legal right to protect my property. Last warning, leave now." More laughter. "That little man? Hell, boys, this'll be easier than we thought." They started moving again, spreading out in a pattern Silas recognized, flanking maneuvers, trying to get on multiple sides so they couldn't be watched at once. Professional rustlers then, or at least experienced ones. They'd done this before, succeeded before, and they weren't about to be scared off by a small rancher and his oversized wife. Silas's hands tightened on the rifle. His heart hammered against his ribs. Fear threatened to swallow him whole. "Silas," Nora said quietly, urgently. "Look at me." He did. In the moonlight, her face was fierce and certain, and in her eyes he saw not doubt, but absolute faith. She believed he could do this. She'd married him, invested everything in him, chosen him fully, and she believed. "You're not alone this time," she said. "Whatever happens, we face it together. You and me, partners." Something in her words reached past the fear, past the trauma, past 6 years of guilt and self-loathing. She was right. He wasn't alone. And maybe that made all the difference. "Together," he agreed. The rustlers were closer now, close enough that Silas could see they were armed, could make out the hard edges of their faces. 5 of them, like he'd counted. Too many for 2 people, too dangerous to face without help that was miles away. But Nora had already thought of that. She raised the shotgun and fired, not at the men, but straight up, the blast echoing across the valley like thunder, loud enough to wake every ranch within 5 miles. Then she fired again and again, methodically spacing her shots to signal distress in the pattern every rancher knew. "You crazy bitch," one of the rustlers shouted. "You just brought every armed man in the county down on us." "That's the idea," Nora called back. Then to Silas, "How long until Tom arrives?" 10 minutes if he's already mounted. Longer if... The nearest rustler raised his pistol. Silas saw it happen in slow motion. The arm coming up, the barrel catching moonlight, the moment before the shot that would kill his wife, his partner, the woman who'd saved him in ways that had nothing to do with bullets. He didn't freeze. Silas raised his rifle and fired in one smooth motion, the hours of practice his father had insisted on years ago, flowing through muscle memory. The bullet took the rustler in the shoulder, spinning him sideways, his shot going wide and harmless into the dirt. "Next one, center mass," Silas shouted, working the bolt action and sighting on the next nearest man. "I don't miss twice." The rustlers hesitated. This wasn't supposed to happen. The small man was supposed to freeze or run. The woman was supposed to be helpless. But here they were, armed and coordinated and clearly not paralyzed by fear. Another rustler raised his gun, aiming at Silas this time. But Nora was faster. She'd reloaded the shotgun and fired, the blast close enough to the man that he dove for cover behind a tree, shouting curses. "We can keep this up all night," Nora called out. "Can you? Because those shots are going to bring half the valley here, and then you'll have to explain why you're on our property with guns drawn." In the distance, Silas heard what he'd been praying for. Horses, multiple riders, coming fast. Tom in his hands, probably, maybe Frank too. Help was coming. The rustlers heard it too. They looked at each other, rapid calculations happening. 2 people with guns was manageable. 2 people plus a dozen angry ranchers was suicide. "This ain't over," one of them shouted. "We'll be back." "We'll be ready," Silas replied, his voice steadier than he felt. They retreated into the tree line, taking their wounded man with them, disappearing into the darkness like smoke. Within minutes, Tom and Frank arrived with 6 riders between them, all armed, all ready for a fight that was already over. "What happened?" Tom demanded, swinging down from his horse. Silas started to answer, but his voice wouldn't work. The adrenaline was draining now, leaving him shaky and sick. He'd shot a man. He'd actually pulled the trigger, hit his target, protected his home. After 6 years of believing himself a coward, he'd acted. "Rustlers," Nora said calmly, filling the silence. 5 of them. They tried to take our cattle. We convinced them to leave." "You too?" Tom looked between them incredulously. "Alone?" "We weren't alone," Nora corrected. "We had each other, and Silas shot one before I'd even finished signaling for help. They left after that." Tom turned to Silas with an expression that might have been respect. "You hit him?" "Shoulder," Silas managed. "Saw the blood." "Damn," Tom said. Then surprisingly, "Good shooting, Boone. That took nerve." It was the first time since James's death that anyone had acknowledged Silas as something other than the coward who froze. The words hit him harder than he expected, and suddenly he couldn't hold it together anymore. His hands started shaking violently, the rifle nearly slipping from nerveless fingers. Nora took it from him gently. "He needs to sit down," she told Tom. "The danger's past, but the cost is just hitting him now." They got Silas to the porch, got him sitting with his head between his knees while Tom and Frank's men swept the property and confirmed the rustlers were gone. Nora sat beside him, her hand on his back, steady and present while he shook apart and tried to piece himself back together. "I did it," he whispered finally. "I didn't freeze. I acted. I shot him." "You protected us," Nora corrected gently. "You faced your worst fear and you didn't let it control you." "I was so scared. I'm still scared." "Of course you are. Fear isn't the enemy, Silas. Letting it stop you is. And you didn't let it stop you." She tilted his chin up so he had to look at her. "You stood with me. You fought for what's ours. That's courage. That's strength." Tom came back as Silas was pulling himself together. "We'll post watches tonight," he announced. "Take turns. They might be stupid enough to come back." "That's not necessary," Silas started, but Tom cut him off. "Neighbors help neighbors," he said firmly. "That's how we survive out here. You'd do the same for us." He looked at Nora. "Both of you would. Hell, you already have." They organized a watch rotation, 3 men staying through the night, taking shifts. Tom insisted on taking first watch himself, saying he owed them for the fence repair and the dozen other small kindnesses Nora had shown his family in the months since her arrival. When the chaos finally settled and they were alone again in their cabin, Silas and Nora sat in the darkness. Neither of them had thought to break with lamplight. The silence between them was full of everything they'd survived, everything they'd proven. "I thought I'd freeze again," Silas said finally. "Thought that when it mattered, I'd be the same useless coward I was 6 years ago." But you weren't, Nora replied. No, because of you. Because you believed I could do it, and that belief made it possible. You did it yourself, Silas. I just reminded you that you could. He turned to her in the darkness. The rustlers. That man whose mother called you a draft horse. Your fiancés who left. Every person who made you feel too big or too much. They were all wrong. You're not too anything. You're exactly enough. You're everything. He heard her breath catch, heard the emotion she was trying to hold back. Don't make me cry, she whispered. I'm trying to be strong. You don't have to be strong all the time, Silas replied. That's what having a partner means. When you're tired, I'll carry the weight. When I'm scared, you'll remind me I'm brave. We take turns being strong, so neither of us has to be strong alone. That broke her. Nora started crying, deep, wrenching sobs that sounded like years of held-back grief finally finding release. Silas held her as best he could, his small frame pressed against her larger one, both of them shaking with emotion and exhaustion, and the aftermath of terror survived. Outside, Tom stood watch in the darkness, protecting their property. Inside, two people held each other through the breaking and the healing, through fear and courage, through every wound they'd carried into this marriage, and the slow, painful work of learning to trust that maybe, just maybe, they'd found the one person in the world who could love them not despite their scars, but because of them. Because those scars told the story of survival, and survival was the foundation everything else could build on. When they finally climbed into bed, exhausted and wrung out, they lay tangled together without awkwardness or distance. The space between them had closed somewhere between the rustler's retreat and this moment, replaced by something solid and true. I love you, Silas whispered into her hair. I love you too, Nora replied. My brave, strong, perfect-sized husband. They fell asleep like that. Two people who'd faced their worst fears and discovered they were stronger together than fear could make them weak apart. And outside, the Montana night kept its vigil, stars wheeling overhead, mountains standing eternal, the valley holding its breath for whatever came next. Morning came too soon, pale light filtering through the curtains Nora had sewn last month, turning the bedroom soft and golden despite the harsh reality waiting outside. Silas woke to find her already dressed, standing at the window with her arms crossed, watching Tom and his men ride out after their night watch. Her face was troubled in a way that made his chest tighten. They'll come back, she said without turning around. Those men, they're not the type to let humiliation stand. Silas sat up, every muscle in his body aching from tension he'd carried through the night. I know. So what do we do? Post guards every night for the rest of our lives? Live in fear waiting for them to try again? She finally turned to face him, and he saw exhaustion in her eyes that had nothing to do with lost sleep. I didn't come all this way to spend my life looking over my shoulder. Neither did I, Silas admitted. He thought about the years after James died, the way fear had become his constant companion, how it had poisoned everything until he'd barely been living at all. But I also won't let what happened to James happen to you. I can't. Nora crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed beside him. Then we need to end this. Not hide from it or wait for it to find us again, but actually finish it. How? We don't even know who they were. But the sheriff might, Nora said. The one you shot, you said there was blood. They'll need medical attention, supplies. Men like that leave trails. And this time, she took his hand. This time we go to the authorities properly. We tell them everything. We make sure the whole valley knows these men are here and what they're trying to do. It was practical, logical, and exactly what should have been done 6 years ago if Silas hadn't been too consumed by grief and guilt to think straight. You're right, he said. We ride to Great Falls after breakfast. Tell Sheriff Morrison everything. Let him organize a proper search. They made the journey into town together, Thunder secured in his pasture with Tom's promise to check on the ranch while they were gone. The sheriff's office sat on Main Street between the bank and the general store, a small building that smelled of old coffee and tobacco smoke. Sheriff Morrison was a weathered man in his 50s who'd seen enough of human nature to be unsurprised by most of it, but his eyebrows climbed when Silas and Nora walked in together and told their story. 5 men, you say? Morrison made notes in a ledger that looked older than Silas. And you wounded one? Shoulder shot, Silas confirmed. Left side, high up. He was bleeding when they retreated. That matches, Morrison said slowly. Had a man come into Doc Miller's office this morning just before dawn. Said he'd been in a hunting accident. Mexican fellow, wouldn't give his name, paid cash and left, soon as the doc stitched him up. Doc thought it was suspicious, bullet wounds pretty distinctive from a hunting accident, but the man was gone before he could get word to me. Which way did he go? Nora asked. East, according to Doc, toward the Badlands. Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying them both. This ties into something bigger. We've had reports from 3 other ranches in the past month. Attempted thefts, suspicious riders, cattle going missing. I've been thinking it's an organized gang working the territory, but I haven't had proof until now. What can we do? Silas asked. You've done it, Morrison replied. You fought back and you came here instead of trying to handle it alone. That's more than most do. Now I can organize a posse, get the territorial marshal involved if needed. These men are getting bold, which means they're getting sloppy. We'll catch them. And until then? Nora's voice was steady, but Silas heard the worry underneath. Until then, you be careful. Keep your weapons close. Don't work the far pastures alone. And, Morrison hesitated, I know this isn't what you want to hear, but consider staying in town for a few days. Let them think the place is empty. See if they're stupid enough to try again when we can catch them in the act. Silas wanted to refuse immediately. The ranch was his home. Walking away felt like surrender. But Nora's hand on his arm stopped him. That's not a bad idea, she said quietly. We can stay at the boarding house. Mrs. Chen has rooms. Nora said, It's tactical, not cowardice, she said firmly. Sometimes the smart fight is the one you don't have. Let the sheriff do his job. Let the law handle what should have been handled 6 years ago. She was right, though it grated against every instinct. They arranged to board at Mrs. Chen's establishment, a tidy house on the edge of town where Frank Chen's mother rented rooms to travelers and occasionally to locals who needed temporary lodging. Then they sent word to Tom about their plans and settled in to wait. The first day passed in restless tension. Silas couldn't shake the feeling that he was abandoning his post, that hiding in town while others protected his property was just another form of the cowardice that had killed James. Nora seemed to sense his spiraling thoughts because she kept him busy, helping Mrs. Chen repair her back porch, running errands for the general store, anything to keep his hands occupied and his mind from eating itself alive. The second day brought unexpected company. They were sitting in Mrs. Chen's parlor after breakfast when someone knocked. Tom and his wife Sarah, along with Frank and 3 other ranchers Silas knew by sight but had never really talked to. Heard you were staying in town, Tom said when Mrs. Chen showed them in. Wanted to check on you both. Make sure you weren't thinking of leaving permanent-like. Why would we leave? Nora asked, confused. Sarah Chen, no relation to Frank despite the shared name, just one of those coincidences common in small communities, stepped forward. She was a tiny woman with steel in her spine and a reputation for speaking her mind. Because that's what happened last time, she said gently. After James died, Silas shut everyone out, stopped coming to town except for supplies, stopped accepting help. We worried you might do the same now. We're not leaving, Silas said firmly. We're just letting the sheriff do his job. Good, Frank said. He pulled out a chair and sat uninvited, the others following suit. Because we've been talking, those of us who ranch in this valley, about the rustling problem, about how it's getting worse, and about how maybe it's time we stopped waiting for them to pick us off one by one and started working together. What are you proposing? Nora asked. A valley association, Tom explained, formal-like with rules and responsibilities. We pool resources for night watches, share information about suspicious activity, support each other when trouble comes. What happened at your place? 5 armed men that could have ended badly. Would have, probably, if you two hadn't been as capable as you are. But not everyone's as capable. Old Marcus Webb, for instance, he's 73 and living alone. If they hit his place, he'd have no chance. So we protect each other, Frank continued. Take turns posting watches on the properties most likely to be hit. Set up signal systems, bells, shots, whatever works, so when trouble comes, everyone knows and everyone responds. Make it so expensive and difficult for rustlers to operate here that they move on to easier territory. It was a good plan, practical and community-minded in a way that frontier life required. Silas felt something ease in his chest, the knowledge that he wouldn't have to face this threat alone, that the isolation he'd wrapped around himself after James's death was finally truly ending. "I'm in," he said. "Whatever you need from us." "We both are," Nora added. "Tell us how we can help." They spent the rest of the morning planning, dividing the valley into zones, establishing a rotation for night watches, deciding on signal protocols and emergency meeting points. Sarah suggested that the women form their own network for sharing information during the day, since they were often home while men worked the far ranges. Nora volunteered to help organize it, and Silas watched with pride as his wife, who'd been rejected and mocked by polite society, took charge of the conversation with natural leadership that made everyone listen. By noon, they had the framework of something real, not just a plan, but a community coming together to protect itself. Tom stood to leave, then paused and looked at Silas directly. "What you did the other night," he said. "Standing your ground, protecting your property. That took more courage than most men have. I know there's been talk over the years about what happened with James, but I want you to know that what I saw at your ranch wasn't a coward. It was a man who'd learned from past mistakes and refused to repeat them. That's worth respecting." The words hit Silas like a physical blow. He'd spent 6 years believing the valley had written him off as the brother who froze, the coward who let James die. To hear Tom, gruff, judgmental Tom who'd made jokes about his mail-order bride, acknowledge his courage meant more than he could express. "Thank you," he managed. "That means a lot." After they left, Silas and Nora sat in the parlor's quiet, processing what had just happened. "Did you arrange that?" Silas asked. "The visit, I mean. Did you talk to Sarah about getting them here?" "No," Nora said. "But I'm glad they came. You needed to hear what Tom said. You've been carrying James's death like a millstone for 6 years. Maybe it's time to set it down." "I don't know if I can." "Not all at once," she agreed. "But maybe piece by piece. Starting with accepting that what happened the other night, you standing with me, fighting for us, that's the truth of who you are now. Not the scared young man you were 6 years ago, but the man you've become since." Before Silas could respond, Sheriff Morrison appeared at the door, his face grim. "Need you both at my office," he said without preamble. "We've got something." They followed him through town to the sheriff's office, where 2 men sat in cells at the back. Rough-looking characters with the kind of faces that advertised hard living and harder choices. One of them had a bandage on his left shoulder, seeping blood through the gauze. "Recognize him?" Morrison asked Silas. Silas studied the wounded man, trying to reconcile the panicked glimpse from 2 nights ago with the surly criminal glaring back at him now. "Could be," he said carefully. "It was dark, but the shoulder wound's right." "Oh, it's him," Morrison said with satisfaction. "Him and his partner here tried to rob the bank this morning. Stupid, desperate move. Got caught within 5 minutes. And once we had them, they started talking, trying to bargain for lighter sentences by giving up the rest of their gang." "Where are the others?" Nora asked. "Camped in the Badlands, according to these 2. Posse rode out an hour ago with territorial marshals leading. Should have them rounded up by nightfall if the information's good." Morrison crossed his arms, looking satisfied. "It's over. Or will be soon. You can go home." Relief flooded through Silas so intensely it left him dizzy. Over. After 6 years of living with the aftermath of violence and the fear of its return, it was actually over. The men who'd tried to take what was his, who'd threatened Nora, who'd made him face his worst memories, they'd be locked up, tried, sentenced. Justice, real justice, not the expensive futility of Pinkerton investigations. "Can we see them?" Nora asked suddenly. Morrison looked surprised. "The prisoners? Why?" "Because I want them to see us," she replied. "Want them to see who they threatened. Want them to understand what they tried to destroy." Morrison shrugged and gestured toward the cells. "Keep your distance from the bars. They're desperate men." Nora walked up to the cells with Silas beside her, and together they looked at the 2 men who'd brought violence to their home. The wounded one, the one Silas had shot, glared back with impotent rage. The other one wouldn't meet their eyes. "You picked the wrong ranch," Nora said quietly. "The wrong family. We're not easy victims. We're not people who break. And now you'll spend the next decade in territorial prison learning that actions have consequences." "That's enough, Mrs. Boone," Morrison said, but there was approval in his voice. They left the sheriff's office and stepped into bright afternoon sunshine that felt different somehow, lighter, cleaner, like the world had been scrubbed of something dark. Silas took Nora's hand and they walked through town together, and for the first time since arriving in Montana Territory, he didn't feel like people were looking at him with pity or judgment. He felt like they were seeing him, seeing them both, as people who belonged. That evening they returned to the ranch to find Tom and several others had not only watched the property but had done repair work, fixing a section of fence, organizing the barn, leaving fresh supplies in the cabin. A note from Sarah said simply, "Welcome home. We're glad you're staying." Standing on their porch as the sun set over the western peaks, Silas put his arm around Nora's waist and felt her lean into him, solid and warm and exactly right. "We did it," he said softly. "We actually did it." "Did what?" "Survived. Both of us. All the things that should have broken us, James, the rustlers, being too small or too big or too damaged to function, we survived them all. And now," he gestured at the ranch, the repaired fence, the evidence of community support. "Now we get to live instead of just surviving." "About that," Nora said, and something in her voice made him look at her sharply. She was smiling, nervous and excited and scared all at once. "There's something I need to tell you. Something I've been waiting to say until I was sure." His heart started hammering. "What is it?" "I'm pregnant," she said simply. "About 2 months along, I think. I wasn't certain until yesterday when Sarah mentioned her daughter had the same symptoms during her first pregnancy, but I'm certain now." The world stopped. Pregnant. A baby. Their child growing inside her, the product of their unlikely union and improbable love. Silas opened his mouth, but no words came out. There were too many emotions trying to escape at once. Too much joy and terror and wonder to compress into language. "Say something," Nora whispered, her smile starting to falter. "Please say something." "I'm going to be a father," he finally managed. "We're going to be parents." "Yes. A baby. Our baby. Someone who will be part you and part me, and entirely themselves." He was crying now, tears streaming down his face in a way he couldn't control and didn't want to. "Nora, that's everything. That's more than I ever thought I'd have." She was crying too, relief and joy mixing with her own fears. "I was scared to tell you," she admitted. "Scared you'd think it was too soon, or that we weren't ready, or that bringing a child into our mess of a situation was irresponsible." "Are you joking?" Silas pulled her down. She had to bend significantly, and kissed her with all the love and gratitude and absolute certainty he felt. "You're giving me a family, a real family, a future. How could that be anything but perfect?" They held each other on the porch as twilight deepened. Two people who'd started as strangers bound by lies and desperation, who'd become partners through honesty and courage, and who were now becoming parents. The weight of it was enormous and terrifying and absolutely right. "Our child," Nora said softly, her hand on her belly, "will know that love doesn't come in one shape, that strength isn't about size, that courage is facing your fears instead of running from them. They'll know they're wanted," Silas added, "that they're loved before they're even born, that they have parents who chose each other fully, scars and all." "Do you think," Nora hesitated, "do you think we can do this? Raise a child? Be good parents?" "I think," Silas said carefully, "that we've already proven we can do impossible things. We turned a paper marriage into a real one. We fought off rustlers. We built a life out of nothing but determination and honesty. If we can do all that, surely we can figure out how to love a child." "Surely," Nora echoed, but he heard the doubt underneath. He understood it. They were both carrying the weight of damaged childhoods, his marked by early loss and crushing guilt, hers by constant rejection for being too much of everything good girls weren't supposed to be. How did people with their histories raise children who felt loved and secure? "We'll make mistakes," Silas said, "probably a lot of them. But we'll make them together, and we'll learn, and our child will know they're loved even when we mess up. That's more than some people get." It's more than either of us got. Nora nodded slowly. Together, she agreed. We do everything together. The next weeks passed in a blur of preparation and adjustment. The territorial marshal's posse had indeed caught the rest of the rustling gang. All 5 men now awaiting trial in Great Falls. The Valley Association Tom had proposed took shape rapidly, with Nora and Sarah organizing the women's network into something remarkably efficient. Information flowed through the community faster than ever before, creating a web of mutual protection that made everyone safer. But the most significant changes were happening at the Boone Ranch. Silas began building a cradle from pine he'd been saving for furniture, his hands working with a care and attention he'd never brought to anything before. Nora sewed tiny clothes from fabric she bought in town, her large fingers surprisingly delicate with needle and thread. They talked endlessly about names, about how to raise a child who felt secure, about all the ways they'd try to be better than their own parents had been able to be. The community's response to Nora's pregnancy surprised them both. Women who'd been politely distant suddenly included her in their circles, offering advice and hand-me-down baby clothes and the kind of practical support that frontier life demanded. Men who'd made jokes about Silas's size now clapped him on the shoulder and called him lucky to have such a strong wife to bear healthy children. It wasn't acceptance exactly, both of them still carried the scars of being different, but it was something close to belonging. One afternoon in late October, with frost touching the grass and winter promising its approach, Sarah came to visit with 3 other ranchers' wives. They found Nora in the garden, harvesting the last of the vegetables before the first hard freeze killed everything. "We wanted to talk to you," Sarah said, her tone serious enough to make Nora worried. "About the summer fair next month." "What about it?" "The community wants to do something special this year," Sarah explained. "To celebrate the Valley Association, the end of the rustling trouble, all the changes that have happened, and we thought—" She glanced at the other women, who nodded encouragement. "We thought you should be in charge of organizing the children's activities." Nora stared at her. "Me? Why me?" "Because you're good with children," Sarah said simply. "I've watched you with my daughters when we visit. You don't talk down to them or treat them like fragile things. You teach them useful skills and make them laugh. That's rare and valuable and exactly what we need for the fair." It was such a small thing in the grand scheme of survival and frontier hardship, organizing games and activities for children at a community fair. But to Nora, who'd spent her life being told she was too much for polite society, too rough for refined company, too unmarriageable to be trusted with social responsibilities, it meant everything. "I'd be honored," she said, her voice thick with emotion she tried to hide. The women spent the afternoon planning, games, contests, lessons in practical skills like tent building and knot tying that frontier children needed to know. Nora found herself laughing, truly laughing, as they worked together. For the first time since leaving St. Louis, she felt like she had friends. Real friends. Not just people who tolerated her presence, but women who valued her contributions. When Silas came in from checking the cattle and found the kitchen full of women and laughter, he stopped in the doorway with an expression of such pure happiness that Sarah noticed and smiled. "Your husband looks pleased," she said to Nora. "He's not used to seeing me happy," Nora replied. Then more quietly, "Neither am I, honestly." The women left as twilight fell, promising to return next week to continue planning. Silas and Nora made dinner together in comfortable silence, moving around each other with the practiced ease of people who'd learned each other's rhythms. "Sarah asked me to organize the children's activities for the fair," Nora said as they ate. "That's perfect," Silas replied. "You'll be wonderful at it." "You think so?" "I know so." He reached across the table and took her hand. "Nora, you've spent your whole life being told you're too much, but you're not. You're exactly enough for this valley, for those children, for me, for our baby. You're exactly what we all needed, even if we didn't know it until you arrived." She squeezed his hand, unable to speak past the emotion in her throat. How had this happened? How had a desperate letter to a matrimonial column led to this? To belonging, to purpose, to love that felt solid enough to build a life on. The fair arrived on a crisp November day, the last warm breath before winter's grip closed over the territory. The entire valley gathered in Great Falls, ranchers and miners, shopkeepers and farmers. Families from 50 miles around coming together for the rare celebration that frontier life allowed. Nora had organized an entire section for children, with stations teaching practical skills disguised as games. Tent building competitions where kids worked in teams. Knot tying races where the fastest correct knots won prizes. A contest to see who could identify the most edible plants from samples she'd gathered. Even a supervised area where children could practice gentling nervous animals under her guidance. It was educational and fun, teaching survival skills while building confidence. And it was mobbed. Children swarmed her stations, laughing and learning and competing with the kind of enthusiasm that made every adult watching smile. Silas stood on the edge of the activity, watching his wife manage 30 children with the same calm competence she brought to everything else. He saw people watching too, not with judgment or mockery, but with appreciation, with respect. Tom appeared beside him, his own children happily engaged in the tent-building competition. "Your wife's something special," he said. "I know," Silas replied. "I'm sorry," Tom said suddenly, "for the jokes when she first arrived, for treating you both like you were something to laugh at instead of something to admire. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Silas looked at him, surprised. Tom Hutchins apologizing was about as common as snow in August. "Thank you," he said. "That means a lot." "You've both earned it," Tom replied. "The way you face those rustlers, the way she's brought this community together, the way you're building something real despite everything stacked against you, that's worth respecting. More than that, it's worth celebrating." As if in response to his words, someone started clapping, then someone else. Within moments, the entire crowd was applauding, for the children's activities, for Nora's organization, for the community spirit she'd helped foster. Nora looked up, startled, her face flushing with pleasure and embarrassment. She caught Silas's eye across the crowd, and he mouthed, "You deserve this." She smiled, that sunrise smile that still took his breath away, and went back to helping a young girl perfect her bowl and knot. They drove home that evening with the wagon full of prize ribbons the children had won, with memories of laughter and belonging, with the knowledge that they'd built something real and lasting in this harsh, beautiful place. The stars came out as they traveled, so many stars that the Milky Way looked like someone had spilled milk across black velvet. "I never thought I'd have this," Nora said softly, her hand resting on her belly where their child grew. "A home. A husband who loves me, of friends. A community that values what I can do instead of mocking what I am." "I never thought I'd forgive myself," Silas replied. "For James, for being small, for all the ways I thought I'd failed. But you taught me that redemption isn't about being perfect. It's about choosing to try again despite every reason not to." "We taught each other," Nora corrected. "That's what partners do." They reached the ranch to find Thunder waiting by the fence, as if he'd been watching for their return. The cabin glowed with lamplight Tom had promised to set burning before they returned. Another small kindness in a growing collection of them. Home. It was really, truly home now. Not just a place to survive, but a place to live, to love, to raise children who would know they were wanted. A place where being too small or too big didn't matter because they were exactly right for each other, and that was enough. Silas helped Nora down from the wagon, and together they walked to their cabin, their home, hand in hand, ready for whatever came next. Because they'd learned that strength came in many forms, that courage was choosing each other despite fear, and that love didn't require perfection, only presence. Behind them, the Montana night settled in with its familiar symphony. Ahead, a future waited, uncertain, challenging, but faced together. And in that moment, standing on the porch of the life they'd built from honesty and determination, Silas and Nora Boone knew they were exactly where they belonged. Winter came to Montana territory with the kind of ferocity that tested everything: fences, roofs, resolve, and the bonds between people who'd chosen to make their stand in this unforgiving land. Snow fell in sheets that turned the world white and silent, burying fences up to their top rails and making even short journeys treacherous. The temperature dropped so low that water froze solid in minutes, and breath turned to ice crystals in the air. But inside the Boone cabin, warmth prevailed. Silas had spent November cutting and stacking enough firewood to last through March, and Nora had preserved enough vegetables and meat to feed them through the darkest months. They were as prepared as frontier life allowed, and more importantly, they were together. Nora's pregnancy progressed through the winter months with surprising ease. She'd worried that carrying a child would make her feel even larger, even more ungainly. But instead, she felt purposeful in a way she never had before. Her body, which had always seemed like a mistake, too big, too strong, too much, was suddenly doing exactly what bodies were meant to do. Growing life, preparing for the future, being enough. Silas watched her change with wonder and protectiveness in equal measure. He built her a rocking chair when she mentioned her back aching, carved it wide and strong with rockers that moved smooth as silk. He made sure she never had to venture into the cold unless she wanted to, taking on every outdoor chore himself, even when the work pushed his small frame to its limits. When she protested that he was doing too much, he simply said, "You're growing our child. The least I can do is grow the firewood pile." By January, Nora was obviously pregnant, her belly rounding in a way that made simple tasks increasingly difficult. Sarah and the other Valley women visited regularly, bringing supplies and advice, and the kind of female wisdom that had been passed down through generations of frontier mothers. They taught her about labor, about nursing, about the 1,000 practical details of keeping an infant alive in harsh conditions. One afternoon, when snow fell thick outside, and the cabin felt like its own small world cut off from everything else, Sarah stayed after the other women left. She helped Nora fold the tiny clothes they'd been sewing, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. "You're nervous," Sarah observed. It wasn't a question. "Terrified," Nora admitted. "What if I'm too rough with the baby? What if my size makes me clumsy? What if I hurt them without meaning to?" "You won't," Sarah said firmly. "I've seen you with animals, with children at the fair. You know how to be gentle. Size has nothing to do with tenderness, Nora. Some of the roughest mothers I've known were tiny women who thought delicate meant caring. You'll be fine. Better than fine." "But what if the baby is small like Silas? What if they inherit his size and I don't know my own strength? And then you'll learn," Sarah interrupted. "The same way every mother learns. By paying attention, by being careful, by loving them so much that gentleness becomes instinct." She paused, her expression softening. "Can I tell you something? When I first heard about you, the giant mail-order bride from St. Louis, I judged you. Thought you must be desperate or deluded to marry a man you'd never met. But watching you these past months, seeing how you and Silas are together, how you've strengthened this whole community just by being who you are, I was wrong. You're not desperate. You're brave. And that baby growing inside you is lucky to have you as a mother." Nora's eyes filled with tears. She tried to blink away. "Thank you," she whispered. "I needed to hear that." After Sarah left, Nora sat in her rocking chair by the fire, her hands on her belly, feeling the baby move inside her. Each kick, each shift felt like a promise that life continued, that hope survived, that love could create something entirely new and precious. Silas came in from the barn, snow dusting his shoulders and hat, his cheeks red from cold. He saw her sitting there, one hand on her belly and tears on her face, and was beside her in an instant. "What's wrong? Is it the baby? Are you hurting?" "I'm fine," she assured him. "Better than fine. Just feeling grateful." He knelt beside her chair, his hand joining hers on her belly. "For what?" "For you. For this." She gestured around the cabin, their home, built and expanded and filled with evidence of their life together. "For getting on that train even though I was terrified. For lying in my letters because I wanted this so badly, I was willing to risk everything for it." "I'm grateful for your lies too," Silas said softly, "because they brought you here. And you brought me back to life." They sat together as the winter storm raged outside, two people who'd found each other through desperation and built something real through honesty, waiting for the spring that would bring their child into the world. February came and went, each day a little longer than the last, winter's grip slowly loosening. March arrived with mud and meltwater, the world transforming from white to brown as snow retreated and revealed the land beneath. Nora was huge now, her belly so round that simple tasks like bending over or putting on boots became complex negotiations with gravity and balance. "I feel like thunder," she complained one morning, trying and failing to see her own feet. Enormous and ungainly and likely to break things accidentally. "You look beautiful," Silas said, meaning it completely, like life itself. "You're biased." "Absolutely," he agreed, "but also right." The baby was due in April, according to Sarah's calculations, which meant they had weeks left to prepare. Silas had converted the small addition off their bedroom into a nursery, painting the walls a warm yellow and installing the cradle he'd built beside a window that caught morning sun. Nora had sewn curtains and made blankets and organized tiny clothes by size in a chest Tom had built as a gift. Everything was ready. They were ready, or at least as ready as two people who'd never done this before could be. On April 3rd, just after dawn, Nora woke to a sensation she'd been told to expect, but still caught her unprepared, a tightening across her belly that built and released like waves on a shore. Not painful yet, but insistent. A signal that time was running out, that the baby had decided today was the day. "Silas," she said, her voice remarkably calm considering the fear coursing through her. "It's time." He was up and dressed in minutes, moving with the kind of controlled urgency that came from practicing this moment in his mind 100 times. He rode to Tom's ranch to fetch Sarah, who'd promised to help with the delivery, then to town for Doc Miller, the old physician who handled everything from cattle diseases to human births with equal competence. By the time he returned to the ranch, the cabin was full of women: Sarah, her daughters, Mrs. Chen, and 3 others from the Valley Association who'd come to help however they could. They'd taken over the bedroom, relegating Silas to the main room, where he paced like thunder in a too-small pen, wearing a path in the floor and driving himself half-mad with worry and helplessness. Tom arrived and sat with him, saying nothing because there was nothing useful to say. Frank came too, and Pete Morrison, and old Marcus Webb. The men gathered without being asked, a silent show of support, waiting for news and offering the kind of company that didn't require words. Inside the bedroom, Nora labored through the morning and into the afternoon. Sarah held one hand, Mrs. Chen the other, both of them offering encouragement and practical advice, while Doc Miller monitored her progress with the detached competence of someone who'd delivered hundreds of babies. "You're doing fine," he kept saying. "Strong as an ox, which is exactly what you want in childbirth. Just keep breathing through the contractions." But as afternoon wore into evening, Doc Miller's expression grew concerned. The baby was taking too long. Something wasn't quite right. The position, maybe, or the size, something that made this harder than it should be. "I might need to intervene," he said quietly to Sarah. "If the baby doesn't turn soon." "No," Nora gasped between contractions. "No cutting. I can do this. I'm strong enough." "Being strong isn't always enough," Doc Miller said gently. "Sometimes we need help." "Then help me," Nora replied. "But don't cut me open, please." What happened next required every ounce of Doc Miller's skill and Nora's determination. He worked to manually turn the baby, his hands gentle but insistent, while Nora breathed through pain that made her earlier discomfort seem trivial. Sarah wiped her forehead with cool cloths. Mrs. Chen murmured encouragement in Chinese and English both. Outside, Silas heard Nora cry out, a sound of such pain and effort that he was halfway to the bedroom door before Tom caught him. "You can't help in there," Tom said firmly. "All you can do is trust that she's strong enough and that the women know what they're doing." "What if she's not?" Silas whispered. "What if I lose her? What if this baby costs me everything that matters?" "Then you'll survive it," Tom said. "The same way you survived James. The same way she survived being rejected by every man in Missouri. You'll survive because that's what people do. But she's not going to die, Silas. She's too damn stubborn, and that baby's too damn wanted. They're both going to be fine." As if in response to Tom's words, a new sound came from the bedroom, a thin, reedy wail that built into a full-throated cry. A baby's cry. Their baby. Silas was through the door before anyone could stop him, bursting into a room that smelled of blood and sweat and something indefinably sacred. Nora lay propped against pillows, her hair plastered to her head with sweat, her face exhausted and transcendent. And in her arms, wrapped in a blanket Sarah had made, was the smallest, most perfect thing Silas had ever seen. "We have a daughter," Nora said, her voice raw from hours of labor but filled with wonder. Silas, we have a daughter. He couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, could only stare at this tiny person who hadn't existed an hour ago and now was the center of his universe. The baby had Nora's dark hair and his small bone structure, and when she opened her eyes, just for a moment, they were the color of honey in sunlight. "Can I hold her?" he asked, his voice breaking. Nora passed the baby to him carefully, and suddenly Silas understood what people meant when they talked about hearts being full. His daughter weighed maybe 7 pounds, so light he was afraid he'd drop her, and when she wrapped her tiny hand around his finger, he felt tears streaming down his face unchecked. "Hello," he whispered. "Hello, little one. I'm your father. I'm going to love you for the rest of my life. I'm going to protect you and teach you and make sure you know you're wanted every single day. I promise." The baby made a small sound, not quite a cry, and nestled against his chest, as if she recognized his voice from the months she'd spent listening to it through Nora's belly. "What should we name her?" Nora asked softly. They'd discussed names for months, but never quite decided. Now, holding his daughter, Silas knew immediately. "Hope," he said. "Hope Nora Boone. Because she represents everything we hoped for and everything your courage made possible." Nora's smile was radiant despite her exhaustion. "Hope," she agreed. "It's perfect." Doc Miller cleared his throat. "Mother and baby both need rest. Everyone out except Silas, and even he shouldn't stay too long." The women filed out, each one stopping to congratulate them, to coo over baby Hope, to marvel at the miracle that was every birth but felt particularly miraculous when it was someone you cared about. Tom stuck his head in long enough to say, "Congratulations," with genuine warmth before herding the other men outside. Finally alone, Silas sat on the edge of the bed, Hope still in his arms, Nora reaching out to touch her daughter's tiny hand. They stayed like that as twilight deepened outside. 3 people who were now a family, processing the enormity of what had just happened. "I was so scared," Nora admitted. "Scared I wasn't strong enough. Scared something would go wrong. Scared I'd fail her before she even drew breath." "But you didn't fail," Silas said. "You brought her into the world through sheer determination and strength. Our daughter is here because of you, Nora, because you're exactly as strong as you need to be." "We did it together," she corrected. "You got help. You trusted the community. You didn't try to handle this alone." "I learned from the best," Silas replied, meaning her. Hope made a small sound, and Nora held out her arms. Silas passed their daughter back carefully, watching as Nora opened her nightgown to nurse for the first time. The baby latched immediately, instinct guiding her towards sustenance, and Nora gasped at the sensation. "Is this normal?" she asked. "Does it always feel like this?" "Like what?" "Like the most natural and the most miraculous thing in the world all at once." Silas smiled. "I think that's exactly what it should feel like." The weeks that followed Hope's birth passed in a blur of sleepless nights and endless wonder. Nora recovered quickly, her strong body bouncing back from childbirth with the resilience that had seen her through every other hardship. Hope proved to be an easy baby. She cried when hungry or wet, but otherwise seemed content to sleep and observe the world with those honey-colored eyes that missed nothing. The Valley community rallied around them in ways that still surprised Silas, despite months of evidence that they'd been accepted. Women brought food and advice. Men helped with ranch work Silas couldn't manage while also caring for an infant. Children came to peek at baby Hope and declare her the prettiest baby they'd ever seen, even when she was red-faced and screaming. Silas learned to change diapers and walk the floor at 3 in the morning, singing lullabies his mother had sung to him decades ago. Nora learned to nurse while doing other tasks, her large hands somehow perfectly suited to cradling a small child. Together they learned the exhausting, exhilarating reality of parenthood, that it was harder than anything they'd done and more rewarding than anything they'd imagined. One warm afternoon in May, when Hope was 6 weeks old and spring had fully arrived, Silas carried his daughter outside for the first time. The world was green and alive, wildflowers carpeting the meadow in every color imaginable. Thunder stood at the fence line, curious about this new small creature, and Silas carefully introduced them. "Hope, this is Thunder. He's not as scary as he looks. Thunder, this is my daughter. You be gentle with her." The bull, this massive beast that had terrorized half the valley, lowered his head and exhaled softly, as if acknowledging the baby's importance. Hope stared at him with wide eyes, unafraid, and Silas felt something profound settle in his chest. His daughter would grow up here, in this valley, surrounded by this community. She would know cattle and wildflowers, harsh winters, and generous neighbors. She would learn that strength came in many forms, and courage meant facing fear. She would never doubt that she was wanted, that she was loved, that she belonged exactly as she was. Nora joined them on the porch, moving with more ease than she had in months, her body returning to its natural strength. She slipped her arm around Silas's waist, and together they looked out at their ranch, expanded now, prosperous, home to cattle and chickens, and a massive bull who'd been gentled by love. "Do you ever think about the letters?" Nora asked. "The lies we told to get here?" "Sometimes," Silas admitted, "but I think maybe they weren't really lies, just hopes we didn't know how to express honestly. You wrote about being gentle and loving wildflowers because that's who you wanted to be, even if you couldn't say, 'I'm 6 feet tall and stronger than most men, and terrified no one will love me anyway.' And you wrote about wanting a quiet life because you couldn't say, 'I'm haunted by my brother's death and afraid I'm too broken to be loved,'" Nora continued. "So we lied our way to truth," Silas said, "and somehow it worked." "It worked because we made it work," Nora corrected. "We could have walked away when we saw each other at that train station, could have called it a mistake and gone back to our separate loneliness. But we didn't. We chose to stay, to try, to build something real from flawed foundations." Hope made a small sound, drawing their attention back to her perfect, tiny face. She'd fallen asleep in Silas's arms, completely trusting, absolutely secure. "She'll never know the lies," Silas said softly. "She'll only know the truth, that her parents loved each other enough to risk everything on possibility." As summer arrived and Hope grew from a tiny infant into a baby with personality and preferences, the ranch bloomed. Silas planted sunflowers at Nora's request, hundreds of them, their seeds brought from town, their bright faces turning to follow the sun across the sky. They grew tall and strong, towering over the garden, visible from miles away. "Why sunflowers?" Tom asked one day when he came to help repair the barn roof. "Because they're too big for their own good," Nora replied, bouncing Hope on her hip while watching Silas and Tom work. "They grow so tall they need support to stay upright, but nobody looks at a sunflower and thinks it's too much. They just think it's beautiful. I want Hope to grow up surrounded by things that are unapologetically large and still considered perfect." Tom was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "That's good thinking," he said. "Really good." The sunflowers became famous in the valley. People would ride out just to see them, a field of gold surrounding the Boone Ranch, visible for miles, marking the home where the smallest cowboy and the largest woman had built something that shouldn't have worked, but did. Where love had proven stronger than expectation, and courage had meant choosing each other every day despite fear. By the time autumn arrived, Hope was 6 months old, sitting up on her own, laughing at everything, reaching for the world with the confidence of a child who'd never been taught to doubt her right to take up space. She was small like Silas, but strong like Nora, with a will that suggested she'd be a force to reckon with once she learned to walk. On Hope's first birthday, they threw a party that brought the entire valley together. Tables were set up in the meadow beneath the sunflowers, groaning under the weight of food everyone had contributed. Children ran wild while adults talked and laughed. Thunder was decorated with ribbons and treated like the gentle giant he'd become. Music played, fiddles and guitars and voices raised in songs that celebrated survival and community. Sarah pulled Nora aside as the sun began to set, painting everything golden. "You know what you've done, don't you?" she asked. "What do you mean?" "You've changed this valley. Before you came, we were all so isolated. Everyone managing alone, everyone trying to prove they didn't need help. Then you arrived, this woman who shouldn't have fit, who broke every expectation, and you taught us that strength means asking for help, that community matters more than pride, that being different isn't the same as being wrong." Sarah smiled. "My daughters talk about you like you're a hero from a story. They say when they grow up, they want to be brave like Mrs. Boone." Nora felt tears prick her eyes. "I'm not brave, I'm just stubborn." "Same thing sometimes," Sarah replied. As darkness fell and the party wound down, as neighbors headed home under stars so bright they cast shadows, Silas and Nora sat on their porch with Hope asleep between them. The cabin behind them was larger now, expanded twice to accommodate their growing family and the life they'd built. The ranch was prosperous, the community was strong, and the future stretched ahead with promise instead of fear. I wrote to the matrimonial column because I was desperate, Silas said quietly, because I thought I needed someone to save me from loneliness and guilt. And I answered because I thought if I could just get far enough away from judgment, I might finally be enough, Nora added. But we were both wrong, Silas continued. We didn't need saving. We needed someone to see us clearly, all our scars and fears and broken pieces, and choose us anyway. We needed each other, Nora said simply. Not perfect versions of ourselves, just the truth of who we are. Hope stirred in her sleep, making the small sounds of dreams. In a few years, she'd be old enough to hear the story of how her parents met, the lies in letters, the shock at the train station, the slow building of trust and love. She'd learned that her father had frozen once when it mattered, but found courage when it mattered most. That her mother had been called too big, too much, too everything, and had learned that size was irrelevant when heart was large enough. She'd grow up knowing that love wasn't about perfection. It was about showing up scared and choosing each other anyway. That family was built not on matching sizes or meeting expectations, but on honesty, determination, and the willingness to see beauty in what others called flawed. The sunflowers rustled in the night breeze, their dried heads heavy with seeds that would plant next year's garden. Thunder lowed contentedly in his pasture. The creek sang its endless song. And on the porch of the home they'd built from courage and lies turned truth, Silas and Nora Boone held their sleeping daughter and each other, grateful for the desperate letters that had brought them together and the honest love that had made them stay. Years later, when Hope was old enough to understand, Silas would take her to visit James's grave on the hillside overlooking the ranch. He'd tell her about her uncle, about mistakes and forgiveness, about how sometimes the hardest person to forgive was yourself. And Nora would teach Hope to calm angry animals with humming, to build fences that lasted, to take up exactly as much space as she needed, without apology. Together they'd raise a daughter who knew that strength came in many forms, that courage meant facing your fears, and that love, real love, didn't require you to be smaller or bigger or different than you were. It only required you to be honest, to be present, and to choose each other through every season. The Montana Territory was harsh and unforgiving, a land that tested everyone who tried to make it home. But for Silas and Nora Boone, who'd started as strangers bound by paper promises and become partners through truth, it was also the place where two people who didn't fit anywhere else had finally found exactly where they belonged, with each other, under endless sky, surrounded by sunflowers that grew unapologetically tall and beautiful, proving that sometimes the best things in life were the ones that refused to apologize for taking up space. Their story would be told for generations. The lonely cowboy and the mail-order bride twice his size, who built a love strong enough to change a valley and raise a daughter who knew, without doubt, that she was wanted exactly as she was. It became the kind of story people told around fires on cold nights, proof that courage and love could transform desperation into destiny, and that sometimes the biggest risks led to the most beautiful rewards. Under the vast Montana sky, in a cabin surrounded by gold sunflowers, the Boone family slept, small, large, and exactly right, their hearts full, their future bright, their love a testament to the power of choosing truth over fear, and each other over everything else.